I am Donovan Pierce. I am 73 years old. On the morning I was supposed to hand over my life savings to my daughter and her husband, I forgot my favorite pen and turned back to the lawyer's waiting room. As I neared the cracked door, I heard my son-in-law laughing. "The stupid old man has signed everything," he said. "We are debt-free." I froze in place, and what my daughter said next made my heart stop. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were weak. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, the kind of morning where the wind off the city streets cuts right through your coat. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, pretending to be the fragile, grieving widower my family so desperately wanted me to be. My beautiful wife Clarice passed away 5 years ago, and ever since that sad day, my daughter Naomi and her husband Bradley had been circling me like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to drop. I had just walked out of the private consultation room at the courthouse, ready to head into the hearing that would legally hand over the management of my massive estate. But halfway down the plush carpeted hallway, I patted my chest pocket and realized I had forgotten the gold fountain pen Clarice had given me on our 30th anniversary. I turned around to go back and get it. That simple, forgotten pen saved my life. The hallway was extremely quiet. The heavy mahogany door to the consultation room was left slightly ajar. Bradley must have thought I was already at the elevators waiting for them. I reached my hand out to push the door open, but the sound of ice clinking against glass stopped me. They were pouring celebratory drinks inside a courthouse waiting room. Then I heard Bradley's voice. It was that arrogant, condescending tone he always used when he thought no one important was listening. Bradley is a white hedge fund manager who grew up with country club memberships and generational wealth. He always looked at me like I was just a lucky blue-collar worker who stumbled into some decent real estate by accident. "The stupid old man has signed everything." Bradley chuckled, his voice echoing clearly through the crack in the door. "The ink is dry on the transfer. We are completely debt-free." I expected Naomi to defend me. I expected my only child, the girl I had worked double shifts for, the girl I had carried on my shoulders through Piedmont Park, to scold her husband for speaking about me that way. Instead, I heard her laugh. It was a cold, calculating sound that sent a literal chill down my spine. "Yes," Naomi replied, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "As soon as the judge bangs the gavel today, his downtown commercial building belongs to your company. And the best part is we do not even have to deal with him anymore. I confirmed the medical transfer this morning. This afternoon, the transport team from the psychiatric ward will come to the house to pick him up. They think he has severe dementia anyway. He will not even know what hit him." My blood turned to ice. My breathing completely stopped. I stood there in the quiet hallway, leaning against the cold wall to steady myself. My own daughter, the child Clarice and I had prayed for, had planned to lock me inside a mental facility just to steal the properties I had worked my entire life to build. I closed my eyes, and the memories of the last 3 months suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The narrative they had been spinning was a carefully constructed trap. Bradley had come to me with fake concern, claiming that my holding company was being aggressively targeted by the government for a massive tax audit. He used complicated financial jargon to confuse me, suggesting that the only way to protect my legacy and the family wealth was to legally merge my assets into his venture capital fund. Naomi had played the role of the terrified, devoted daughter perfectly. She would bring me special herbal teas at night that always left me feeling groggy and disoriented the next morning. She would hide my reading glasses and tell me I was losing my mind. They orchestrated an entire psychological warfare campaign to make me doubt my own sanity. I had played along, acting slow and confused because I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. But I never imagined they were planning to strip me of my human rights and lock me in a padded room. I remembered the days when I worked on the loading docks. My hands were calloused and bleeding, but I smiled because I was building a future for my family. Clarice used to pack my lunch and tell me that one day our daughter would never have to struggle. We gave Naomi the best of everything: private schools, luxury cars, and a massive wedding when she married Bradley. But giving her everything had completely ruined her character. She became superficial. She worshipped status and looked down on the very working-class roots that paid for her privilege. When she brought Bradley home, I saw right through him. I saw a man who wore $5,000 suits but possessed a 5-cent soul. He was all presentation and zero substance. Bradley thought I was just an ignorant old black man who owned a few lucky pieces of dirt in the city. He thought his fancy degrees and his pale skin made him inherently smarter than me. But Bradley did not know the truth. He did not know that I built a massive logistics and real estate empire from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail in a world that constantly tried to keep me at the bottom. I did not inherit a single dime. I bled for my fortune, and I deliberately kept my true net worth hidden from everyone, including Naomi, because I knew money could corrupt a weak soul. Bradley was putting up a facade of extreme success, but I knew his fund was failing. He was drowning in massive debt trying to keep up appearances, and my prime real estate in the heart of Atlanta was his only ticket out of total bankruptcy. I listened as they continued to celebrate their supposed victory. I can finally buy that summer house I wanted. Naomi sighed happily. We are going to be filthy rich, Bradley. We deserve this. He has been hoarding that property for decades, doing absolutely nothing with it. It is about time someone with real vision took over. I felt a slow, dangerous rage burning deep inside my chest. It was not the chaotic, screaming anger of a young man. It was the cold, calculated fury of an apex predator who has just been invited to a feast. They thought they had backed a helpless sheep into a corner. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a silverback wolf. I had signed their thick stack of papers yesterday with trembling hands, playing the part of the defeated old man perfectly. But they were so blinded by their own greed and their inherent underestimation of me that they never bothered to truly read the documents I handed back to them. All right, I am going to go find the old fool, Bradley said, his voice suddenly growing louder. We need to get him into the courtroom before he forgets his own name. I heard the heavy clank of his expensive leather shoes stepping toward the door. The brass handle began to turn. I moved silently, stepping backward into the deep shadows of an alcove just down the hall. My heart was pounding a steady rhythmic war drum against my ribs. As Bradley stepped out into the hallway, looking around with a smug, victorious smirk on his face, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket. My fingers tightly gripped a small metal storage drive. Bradley thought he had just outsmarted a senile, uneducated old man. He was about to walk into that courtroom expecting a royal coronation. He had absolutely no idea who he was really dealing with, and by the time the judge banged that gavel, his entire life was going to be violently torn apart. I waited in the shadows of the hallway until Bradley completely disappeared around the corner. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. I rolled my shoulders forward, letting my spine curve just enough to look frail. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my hands to tremble slightly. I became the broken, exhausted old man they needed me to be. I shuffled slowly toward the heavy double doors of the courtroom. My walking cane tapped a rhythmic hollow sound against the polished marble floor. Every single step was calculated. When I pushed open the doors, the air inside the courtroom felt stale and heavy with impending betrayal. Bradley and Naomi were already seated at the massive oak table at the front of the room. They looked like the perfect picture of a loving, concerned family. Bradley wore a navy blue tailored suit that screamed Wall Street privilege and unearned confidence. Naomi wore a modest gray dress with zero jewelry. It was a stark contrast to her usual designer labels and diamond necklaces. She was deliberately dressing down for the judge, playing the part of the humble, devoted daughter taking care of her sick father. I slowly took the empty seat next to my daughter. She immediately reached out and placed her soft, manicured hand over my rough, calloused knuckles. "Dad, you made it," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial relief and fake warmth. "I was getting so worried about you wandering off." I just nodded slowly, letting my eyes wander aimlessly around the courtroom, acting like a confused child who did not fully understand where he was. Bradley leaned over Naomi's shoulder and gave me a tight, patronizing smile. "Just relax, Donovan," he said smoothly, patting my back. "We are going to take care of everything today. Your legacy is completely safe with me." I kept my face entirely blank, but my mind was playing back the meticulous psychological warfare they had waged against me over the past 3 months. It all started back in late October. Bradley had burst into my home office unannounced, carrying a heavy leather briefcase and wearing a face full of manufactured panic. He slammed a thick stack of heavily redacted documents onto my desk. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that the Internal Revenue Service was launching a massive, aggressive audit into my primary holding company. He used big, intimidating words designed to trigger fear. He talked about federal asset seizure, criminal tax evasion charges, and unpaid corporate liabilities dating back 20 years. He paced around my study, acting like a financial savior who had just uncovered a ticking time bomb. He told me that the government was aggressively targeting elderly business owners. He claimed that because my companies were structured decades ago under outdated tax laws, they could freeze my bank accounts and seize my commercial properties within a matter of weeks. Bradley genuinely thought he was a genius. He looked at me, a 73-year-old black man who started his business with a single delivery truck, and assumed I was completely ignorant of modern corporate finance. He assumed I relied on outdated accountants and blind luck to manage my wealth. He proposed a solution that he claimed would magically save the family empire. He wanted me to legally merge my entire estate into his elite venture capital fund. He promised that his team of high-priced corporate lawyers would shield my assets behind a fortress of impenetrable corporate structures. He said he would take the legal bullet for me. He presented it as the ultimate heroic sacrifice of a devoted son-in-law. What this arrogant fool did not know was that my holding company was cleaner than a freshly sterilized hospital room. I had a team of ruthless top-tier financial advisors who ensured my empire was absolutely bulletproof. There was no IRS audit. There was no federal investigation. It was a complete and utter fabrication designed to panic a tired old man into signing away his life. But the financial lies were not what broke my heart. The business world is full of snakes, and I was used to dealing with them. What truly destroyed my soul was Naomi. My own flesh and blood played the role of the emotional executioner. Whenever I hesitated or asked to have my own independent lawyers review Bradley's proposal, Naomi would step in and turn on the tears. I remember one specific evening in my living room. She sat on the floor next to my armchair, resting her head on my knee, exactly like she did when she was a little girl. She cried real convincing tears that soaked through my trousers. She begged me to trust her husband. She looked up at me and said, "Dad, please do not let the government take away everything you and Mom built. Mom would want us to protect the family. We are just trying to keep you safe from going to prison." She weaponized the sacred memory of my dead wife to manipulate me into giving up my fortune. She used Clarice as a pawn in her greedy game. That was the exact moment the loving father she knew died forever, and the ruthless businessman she never knew was awakened. I realized sitting in that armchair that she was not my daughter anymore. She was a treacherous stranger wearing my daughter's face, completely willing to trade my dignity and my freedom for a beach house and a luxury lifestyle. So I decided to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. Yesterday afternoon, they brought the final merger documents to my house. It was a massive stack of legal papers over 2 inches thick. Bradley stood over my shoulder, pointing to the yellow sticky notes indicating exactly where I needed to sign. He was sweating heavily with anticipation. He thought he was minutes away from securing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio that would secretly wipe out his massive hidden debts. I picked up the pen and put on the performance of a lifetime. I let my hand shake violently. I pretended to have severe trouble reading the small print. I asked the same senseless questions over and over again, acting like my mind was completely lost in a fog. Bradley was losing his patience, his voice snapping with heavy irritation as he repeatedly tapped the signature lines with his manicured finger. Finally, with a terribly trembling hand, I signed my name on the very last page. I saw the absolute greedy triumph wash over Bradley's face as he snatched the papers away from me, hugging them to his chest. He thought I was a senile fool who did not bother to read the fine print. He thought I had blindly handed him the permanent keys to the kingdom. But my eyes are still razor sharp and my mind never misses a single legal detail. I had read every single word. I knew exactly what I was doing. Now, sitting in the quiet tension of the courtroom, I felt the heavy wooden doors open behind us. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. Everyone in the room immediately stood up. The judge took his seat at the high mahogany bench, looking severely over his reading glasses at our table. To my right sat a slick, overly groomed lawyer that Bradley had hired specifically for this hearing. He was legally supposed to be representing my best interests, but I knew he was entirely on Bradley's payroll. His only job was to make sure the asset transfer went smoothly, quickly, and quietly before anyone asked too many questions. As we all sat back down, the sleazy lawyer leaned his head close to my ear. He smelled of cheap mints and expensive arrogance. His voice was a hushed, highly patronizing whisper meant for a toddler. "Listen carefully, Mr. Pierce," the lawyer muttered without even looking at me. "The judge is going to ask you a series of standard questions to confirm your competency and your consent to this merger. Do not overthink anything. Just say yes to everything he asks you. Let me do all the talking and we will have you out of here in 10 minutes so you can go home and rest." I did not nod. I did not agree. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. I let my posture straighten up just a fraction of an inch. The trembling, terrified old man vanished completely from my face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating stare of a man who owned half the commercial buildings in the city. I smiled a very slow, bone-chilling smile. I have the right to say no, do I not? The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. The heavy oak walls seemed to press inward, but the only pressure I felt was the repulsive, greedy energy radiating from the two people sitting to my left. My daughter Naomi was dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, putting on an absolute masterclass in theatrical sorrow. Beside her, Bradley could barely sit still. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He kept adjusting his expensive silk tie and glancing up at the judge like a starving man staring at a locked vault, just waiting for the combination to click open. He thought he had completely won. He thought this grand old building in the heart of Atlanta was going to be the place where he stripped a tired, grieving old black man of everything he had built. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, flipped through the massive stack of documents on her desk. The slick, overly perfumed lawyer Bradley had hired to supposedly represent my best interests stood up. He buttoned his jacket with a smug, self-important flair and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with that fake, sympathetic tone lawyers use when they are hiding a dagger behind their backs. "We are here today to finalize a voluntary asset merger and enact a durable power of attorney for my client, Mr. Donovan Pierce. As you can see from the submitted medical evaluations, Mr. Pierce is entering a stage of life where managing his extensive portfolio has become an overwhelming and detrimental burden to his health." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my wooden cane. I listened to this arrogant stranger paint me as a fading, incompetent shell of a man. He spoke about me as if I was already dead and buried. My son-in-law Bradley, the lawyer continued, gesturing grandly toward the pale, sweating fraud sitting next to me, has graciously offered to step in and absorb Mr. Pierce's commercial real estate holdings into his own elite venture capital fund. This includes the complete transfer of the downtown Atlanta commercial district currently held under the Pierce Legacy banner. This merger will protect the family wealth and ensure Mr. Pierce is properly cared for in a specialized psychiatric facility, alleviating any further stress on his declining cognitive state. There it was, the ultimate betrayal said out loud for the official court record. They were not just taking my life work. They were formally requesting the legal authority to lock me inside a mental institution. I looked at Naomi. She refused to make eye contact with me, staring resolutely at the mahogany table. Bradley, however, could not hide his sheer delight. He looked over at me and offered a tight, victorious smirk. It was the smirk of a man who thought he had just stolen a multi-million-dollar empire without shedding a single drop of his own blood. He thought I was just going to nod along, take my medication, and disappear into a padded room so he could pay off his massive hidden debts with my money. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly down at me. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice echoing clearly through the silent room, "these are incredibly profound legal steps. You are signing away your complete autonomy, your medical rights, and the totality of your financial assets. I need to hear it directly from you for the record. Do you fully understand the gravity of these documents? Are you completely competent, and are you executing this transfer of your own free will without any outside coercion whatsoever?" The tension in the room was absolute. Naomi finally reached over and squeezed my hand tightly. Her grip was desperate, silently begging me to play my part and end my own life. The slick lawyer leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. "Just say yes, Donovan," he whispered firmly. "Say you agree, and we can all go home. Let me handle this." I looked at the lawyer. I looked at Naomi's fake, tear-stained face. And then I looked directly at Bradley. His smug smirk was plastered across his pale face, his eyes shining with unearned triumph. I did not say yes. I did not nod my head. Instead, I slowly pulled my calloused hand out from under Naomi's grip. I placed my wooden cane flat on the table and pushed my chair back. I stood up. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not let my hands tremble. I stood up to my full height, straightening my spine, dropping the pathetic, frail facade I had worn for 3 agonizing months. I stood tall, projecting the absolute, terrifying authority of a man who had conquered the unforgiving streets of Atlanta to build an untouchable empire. The smirk on Bradley's face instantly vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. The slick lawyer took a nervous step back, suddenly realizing that the old sheep he thought he was guiding to the slaughterhouse had just transformed into a silverback wolf. I reached down and picked up the thick stack of medical proxy and power of attorney documents lying on the table. I held them up for the judge to see. Then in the dead silence of the courtroom, I gripped the thick stack of premium legal paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Naomi gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. Bradley shot out of his chair, his face turning completely white. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Donovan, sit down." "You are confused." I ignored him completely. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, destroying the forged medical evaluations and the fraudulent transfer agreements, turning their entire greedy conspiracy into worthless confetti. I let the shredded pieces fall from my hands, raining down onto the polished mahogany table. I turned to the slick lawyer, who was staring at me with his mouth hanging wide open. "I do not need your services anymore, counselor," I said, my voice deep, resonant, and dripping with absolute menace. "You are officially fired. Take your briefcase and step away from my table before I have you investigated for legal malpractice." The judge slammed her gavel down hard, the sharp crack echoing off the walls. "Order in the court," she demanded, leaning forward over her bench. "Mr. Pierce, what is the meaning of this outburst? Are you refusing to proceed with this hearing?" Bradley was hyperventilating now. "Your Honor, please," he pleaded, his voice high-pitched and desperate. "You can see he is not in his right mind. He is having a severe cognitive episode. We need to execute the medical proxy immediately for his own safety. He is completely incompetent." I did not even look at Bradley. I kept my eyes locked respectfully on the judge. "I am perfectly competent, Your Honor," I replied, my tone steady and unwavering. "And I am refusing to proceed because this entire hearing is built on a foundation of deception, extortion, and fraud." Before the judge could respond, before the bailiff could even take a step toward our table, a massive, thunderous crash echoed from the back of the room. The heavy oak double doors of the courtroom were thrown violently open, hitting the walls with a resounding crack that made everyone in the room jump. I did not need to turn around to know who had just arrived. I felt the atmosphere in the room completely shift. Footsteps echoed down the center aisle. Heavy, confident, unstoppable footsteps. Walking toward the front of the courtroom was Lincoln. Lincoln was my oldest friend, a man I had bled beside in the darkest days of our youth, and now the most feared, ruthless, and highly connected corporate attorney in all of Atlanta. He was 65 years old, a powerful black man in a custom-tailored midnight blue suit radiating an aura of absolute destruction. Flanking him on either side were two massive stone-faced private security contractors who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. Bradley turned around to look, and all the remaining color drained out of his face. Even the slick lawyer stepped backward, recognizing the legendary legal titan walking down the aisle. Lincoln did not slow his pace. He marched straight past the wooden gate, ignoring the bailiff completely. He walked right up to the front of the room, pulled a thick, heavy stack of documents stamped with bright red official seals from his leather briefcase and slammed them down directly onto the judge's bench. "Your Honor." Lincoln announced, his booming, gravelly voice commanding the absolute attention of every single soul in that room. "My client, Mr. Donovan Pierce, has a permanent change in legal representation. We are officially halting this asset transfer." Furthermore, Lincoln paused, turning his head slowly to lock eyes with the pale, trembling, terrified excuse for a man that was my son-in-law. "We are filing an immediate injunction, and we would like to formally report a massive federal-level financial fraud." The courtroom erupted the second the heavy oak doors closed behind Lincoln. Naomi leaped out of her chair like she had touched a live wire, her face contorted into a mask of absolute desperate panic. "Your Honor," she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Lincoln. "You cannot listen to this man. My father is severely ill. He has advanced dementia. He does not know what he is saying or doing. This lawyer is just a predator trying to take advantage of a confused, elderly man who cannot protect himself." She tried to force tears out of her eyes again to play the victim, but the well had completely run dry. Her performance was violently cracking under the heavy weight of Lincoln's dominant presence. Bradley jumped up right beside her, gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Bradley stammered, trying desperately to summon his usual arrogant country club drawl. "This is a closed family proceeding. This man has no jurisdiction here. The documents were fully verified by my legal team. The medical records clearly state my father-in-law is totally unfit to manage his own estate. You must order security to remove this man from the courtroom." The judge banged her heavy wooden gavel loudly, demanding immediate order. She looked down at the massive stack of files Lincoln had just dropped onto her bench. "Counselor," she said, her voice sharp and questioning, "you just made a very serious accusation of federal financial fraud in my courtroom. You better have the bulletproof evidence to back it up." Lincoln did not even blink. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his midnight blue tailored suit and turned to face the judge with a calm, terrifying confidence. "I have a mountain of evidence, Your Honor," Lincoln replied, his deep voice echoing like thunder against the courtroom walls. "I have evidence that will prove this entire hearing is nothing but a desperate criminal charade orchestrated by a man drowning in his own colossal failures." Lincoln turned his imposing gaze toward the defense table. Bradley physically shrank back under the intensity of that stare. For years, this pale, arrogant man had strutted around our family gatherings acting like he was the ultimate financial savior. He loved to use big Wall Street words to make himself sound invincible while looking down on my calloused hands. He carried that unearned privilege like a shield, thinking a black man who built his wealth in logistics could never understand the complex high society world of venture capital. But right here in this courtroom, my old friend Lincoln was meticulously skinning him alive. Let us talk about the elite venture capital fund managed by Mr. Bradley Sterling. Lincoln announced, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. Mr. Sterling has spent the last 3 months terrorizing my client with fabricated stories about aggressive government audits and federal asset seizures. He claimed his investment fund was a safe harbor for the Pierce family wealth. He told my client he was being a heroic son-in-law stepping in to save the family legacy. But the reality, Your Honor, is that Mr. Sterling's fund is nothing but a hollow shell. It is currently under an active criminal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for massive wire fraud and embezzlement. Bradley let out a choked, desperate gasp. The slick lawyer he had hired quietly slid his chair a few inches away, trying to distance himself from the blast zone. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Lincoln pulled a certified financial document from his leather briefcase and held it up high for the judge to see. "Mr. Sterling is not a successful hedge fund manager," Lincoln continued, relentlessly, completely destroying the illusion Bradley had spent years building. "He is a degenerate gambler wearing a $5,000 suit. He has completely liquidated his investors' capital on terrible high-risk tech gambles. He is currently $12 million in debt. And he does not owe this money to standard corporate banks, Your Honor. He owes $12 million to a highly dangerous syndicate of underground lenders operating out of the West Side." Bradley was sweating profusely now. The smug superiority that usually coated his face had completely melted away, revealing the terrified, broke coward hiding underneath. His chest heaved as he panted like a cornered animal. Naomi stared at her husband with wide, horrified eyes, finally realizing that her entire life of luxury was funded by a criminal house of cards. Lincoln paced slowly in front of the table, refusing to let them breathe. "These underground lenders have given Mr. Sterling a violent ultimatum," Lincoln explained, his voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling register. He needed to provide massive physical collateral by the end of this week, or they were going to collect their $12 million debt in blood. Mr. Sterling has absolutely zero assets to his name. His luxury cars are leased, his country club memberships are suspended for non-payment, his bank accounts are deeply in the red. So he looked at his elderly black father-in-law, the man who built a real estate empire from the dirt up, and decided to steal his life work to save his own skin. He paid a corrupt doctor to forge those medical documents. He manipulated his own greedy wife. He planned to lock my client in a psychiatric ward today just so he could use the Pierce downtown commercial district as collateral to save his own miserable life. The judge flipped through the certified financial records Lincoln had provided. Her expression shifted from stern neutrality to absolute disgust as she read the undeniable proof of Bradley's massive multi-million-dollar fraud. Naomi collapsed back into her chair, sobbing hysterically. But this time she was not crying for me. She was crying because the illusion of her wealthy upper-class lifestyle had just been publicly shattered. She realized she was married to a penniless fraud who was about to go to federal prison. But Bradley was not finished. Desperation is a highly dangerous drug, and it makes cornered men do incredibly foolish things. The reality of his exposure pushed him completely over the edge. Bradley slammed his hands down violently on the heavy oak table. He leaned forward, his eyes completely bloodshot, his hair disheveled and wild. The country club gentleman was gone, replaced by a rabid, screaming maniac. He pointed a shaking, manic finger directly at me. "It does not matter," Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing frantically off the high ceilings. "It does not matter what you say about my company. It does not matter what you say about my debts." He turned his wild gaze up to the judge, pointing at the original stack of papers on her desk. "You cannot stop this transfer, Your Honor. The ink is already dry." He looked back at me, a twisted, sick smile of desperate triumph spreading across his sweating face. "You signed it, Donovan. You sat in your living room yesterday shaking like a pathetic old leaf, and you signed the entire stack of merger documents. The signature is 100% real and legally binding. That prime downtown land has already been legally merged into my holding company. You cannot take it back now. You are too late, old man. It is mine. The assets belong to me." The courtroom fell dead silent. Naomi looked up, a tiny flicker of greedy hope suddenly returning to her tear-stained face. She thought they had actually managed to win on a technicality. Lincoln just stood there, crossing his massive arms over his chest and looking at me with a quiet, knowing smirk. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout back at the hysterical man throwing a tantrum across the table. I simply picked up my wooden cane and leaned my weight onto it, staring deeply into Bradley's frantic, bloodshot eyes. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to sit in the agonizing, heavy tension. "Yes, Bradley," I said slowly, my voice completely calm and smooth like ice water. "I did sign that heavy stack of documents yesterday afternoon. I signed exactly where your little yellow sticky notes told me to sign. But tell me something, Bradley." I paused, letting a cold, merciless smile spread across my face. "Did you actually bother to read the fine print? Did you look carefully to see exactly what company I signed over to you?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The heavy oak walls seemed to absorb the suffocating tension radiating from the defense table. Bradley stared at me. His chest heaved up and down in rapid, erratic jerks. He looked back at the thick stack of papers resting on the judge's bench and then back at me. He shook his head vigorously, his perfectly styled hair falling messily across his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger at the documents and insisted that his lawyers had vetted every single page. He stated that the cover sheet clearly indicated the transfer of the primary Pierce commercial portfolio. He called me a liar. He shouted that I was just a senile old man trying to play desperate mind games to stall the inevitable transfer of my wealth. I let out a slow, deep breath. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a quiet, terrifying intensity that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. I told Bradley that he was a man who only reads the cover of a book because he is far too lazy to do the actual heavy lifting. I told him that for 3 entire months he severely underestimated my intelligence. He looked at my calloused hands and my quiet demeanor and assumed I was just a tired old man who struck it rich by sheer blind luck. He assumed his expensive degrees and his unearned privilege made him naturally superior to me. But I built my empire in the 1970s and 80s. I built it when the banks in Atlanta would not even look at a black man asking for a commercial loan. I had to read every single line of every single contract because the entire financial system was specifically designed to make me fail. I told Bradley that I did not survive 40 years in the ruthless commercial real estate market by being careless. I survived because I always see the knife before it is drawn. I turned my head and looked at Naomi. My daughter was trembling violently in her chair, clutching her expensive designer handbag like it was a life preserver. I told her that she should have remembered how I taught her to read the fine print before she ever signed her first apartment lease. But she forgot her roots. She let a man in a fancy suit convince her that her own father was an expendable piece of garbage. She traded her loyalty for the illusion of high society, and now she was going to pay the ultimate price for her betrayal. Bradley slammed his hand on the mahogany table again, demanding to know what I was talking about. He demanded the judge finalize the order. Lincoln stepped forward. His heavy leather shoes echoed like a ticking clock in the silent courtroom. He pointed a long, steady finger at the documents on the judge's desk. Lincoln told the judge to turn to page 142, the final schedule of assets, the actual legally binding transfer agreement that Bradley was so desperate to execute. The judge turned the heavy pages. The courtroom was so absolutely still that the crisp rustle of the paper sounded like a roaring fire. She found the specific page. She read it silently, Her eyes widened behind her reading glasses in absolute profound shock. She looked up slowly, staring at Bradley with a mixture of deep pity and severe judicial judgment. I looked directly into Bradley's bloodshot, panicked eyes. I explained it to him very slowly so his desperate brain could fully process the terrifying reality of his doom. I told him that he did not merge his elite venture capital fund with Pierce Legacy. Pierce Legacy is my primary holding company. It owns the downtown commercial district, the luxury apartment buildings, and the massive logistics warehouses. I told him I would never let a pathetic parasite like him touch a single brick of Pierce Legacy. I explained that what he actually signed for what he so desperately rushed me to sign yesterday in my living room was a completely different subsidiary. It was a dummy corporation I created years ago, a company called Pierce Industrial. Bradley frowned deeply. His breathing became incredibly shallow. He wiped the cold sweat from his upper lip and asked what Pierce Industrial was. I smiled. It was a cold, hollow smile devoid of any warmth or mercy. I told him that in the late 1980s I bought a massive abandoned chemical manufacturing plant on the far south side of the city. It was the worst investment I ever made. The previous owners had illegally dumped toxic chemical runoff deep into the soil for decades before fleeing the state. I tried to clean it up, but the environmental damage was far too extensive. I sealed the property off and let it sit. But last year, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency came knocking on my door. The EPA surveyed the land. They officially designated it as a massive federal Superfund site. They issued a mandatory immediate soil remediation and toxic cleanup mandate. I paused, letting the heavy, crushing silence sink deep into his bones. Bradley was completely frozen. He looked like a man standing on railroad tracks watching a massive freight train hurtle directly toward his face. I told him that the EPA fined my subsidiary and mandated a federal cleanup operation that will cost exactly $15 million. It is a completely non-negotiable absolute federal debt. If the owner of the company fails to pay for the cleanup, the federal government will aggressively seize all their personal assets and prosecute them for severe environmental negligence leading to years in federal prison. Naomi let out a high-pitched, horrifying scream. She covered her ears with both hands as if that would somehow stop the words from being true. She finally realized that her husband was not a financial genius. He was a monumental fool who had just ruined their entire lives. I told Bradley that I isolated that massive toxic liability entirely into Pierce Industrial. I knew he was coming for my money. I knew he had hired slick, arrogant lawyers who only cared about pushing the paperwork through quickly to get their commission. So my legal team, led by Lincoln, deliberately drafted the merger documents to look exactly like a transfer of my primary wealth. But in the fine print buried deep in the dense legal jargon, we swapped the holding company names. We gave him the ultimate Trojan horse. I explained that yesterday, when I was shaking and dropping my pen, acting like a confused, broken old man, I was just playing a character. I was actively distracting him. I wanted him to be so blindly focused on securing my signature that he never bothered to look at the final appendix, and his overwhelming arrogance made him fall for it perfectly. He took the bait. He swallowed the poison pill whole. Bradley began to shake. His entire body trembled violently inside his expensive navy blue suit. He looked at his slick lawyer, pleading silently for help. The lawyer refused to even make eye contact. The lawyer was already packing his briefcase, snapping the latches shut, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a man who had just inherited a catastrophic federal toxic waste disaster. Lincoln stepped right up to the mahogany table, towering over Bradley like an absolute force of nature. Lincoln's voice boomed through the courtroom, delivering the final crushing blow that would echo in Bradley's nightmares for the rest of his life. "Congratulations, Bradley," Lincoln announced, his voice filled with righteous, brutal authority. "Instead of stealing $20 million in clean commercial real estate assets, my client has legally and permanently transferred $15 million of federal toxic debt directly into your name. You signed the merger. The ink is completely dry. The judge has the record. You are now the sole legal owner of Pierce Industrial and the sole individual personally responsible for the EPA federal mandate." Lincoln leaned down, placing his large hands flat on the table, bringing his face just inches away from Bradley's pale, sweating forehead. "Let us do the basic math," Bradley Lincoln whispered, but the microphone on the table picked it up perfectly, broadcasting his words to the entire room. "You owe $12 million to a violent underground syndicate who wants their money in cash by the end of the week. And as of yesterday afternoon, you now officially owe $15 million to the federal government of the United States. You do not have a single penny to your name. You now owe a grand total of $27 million. You are trapped between the mob and the feds. You are not just bankrupt. You are completely and utterly destroyed. The realization of his absolute financial and legal death crashed down on Bradley all at once. The fake veneer of the wealthy, privileged executive completely shattered into a million pieces. He realized he had been entirely outsmarted and outmaneuvered by the elderly black man he viewed with such deep, arrogant contempt. He realized he walked willingly into a beautifully designed trap that would either get him killed by loan sharks or lock him away in a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. Bradley's legs completely gave out. He let out a guttural, agonizing moan that sounded like a dying animal. He collapsed, sliding right off his expensive leather chair and dropping heavily onto the hard, polished floor of the courtroom. He fell to his knees, grasping his hair, pulling at the roots, weeping uncontrollably with the unrestrained terror of a man who knows he has absolutely no way out. Bradley knelt on the polished wood floor of the courtroom. His entire body was shaking violently. The invisible weight of $27 million in insurmountable debt was physically crushing the breath out of his lungs. He stared at the mahogany table, then at the judge, and finally at his wife. The realization that he had just been handed a massive federal toxic waste liability shattered his arrogant mind completely. The smooth, wealthy hedge fund manager vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, panicked animal. He scrambled to his feet. He did not lunge at me or my lawyer Lincoln. He knew my security team would break him in half before he took 2 steps. Instead, the terrified coward turned his absolute fury onto the only person left in his sinking boat. He turned on my daughter. Bradley lunged at Naomi. He grabbed the shoulders of her modest gray dress, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of red. He shook her violently, his voice echoing shrilly across the silent room. "You lied to me," Bradley screamed, completely losing control. "You swore to me he was a senile old fool. You told me his brain was turning to mush. You said he could not even read the morning paper anymore. You told me he would sign anything we put in front of him without asking a single question. You stupid, greedy woman. You brought this toxic federal debt into my company. You ruined my life." Naomi shrieked in genuine terror, throwing her hands up to protect her face. The courtroom bailiffs immediately sprang into action. 2 heavy-set officers rushed forward, grabbing Bradley by the arms, ripping him away from my daughter and shoving him hard against the wooden railing of the defense table. They pinned him there, ordering him to remain completely still. Naomi stumbled backward, panting heavily. Her hair had fallen out of its perfect, neat updo, hanging messily around her face. She looked around the courtroom, her eyes darting wildly. She saw the sheer disgust on the face of the judge. She saw the slick lawyer packing his briefcase and sprinting for the exit to avoid any association with their massive fraud. She saw my lawyer Lincoln standing tall, crossing his arms with a look of absolute triumph. Naomi realized that the walls had completely closed in. Her husband was destroyed, and she was going down with him. So my daughter did what she had always done when she was caught in a lie. She immediately abandoned her partner and played the desperate victim. Naomi pushed herself away from the defense table and dropped heavily to her hands and knees. She crawled across the polished courtroom floor, closing the distance between us. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, burying her wet face against my tailored trousers. She began to sob loudly, her wails echoing tragically through the high ceilings of the courtroom. "Dad," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Dad, please listen to me. I did not know. I swear to God I did not know what he was really planning. Bradley forced me to do this. He is a manipulative monster. He threatened me. He told me we were just trying to protect your assets from the government. I am your little girl, Dad. You are my father. You have to save me from him. I love you. Please do not let them destroy my life." I looked down at the woman clinging desperately to my legs. The entire courtroom was dead silent, waiting to see if the unconditional love of a father would override the cold logic of a betrayed man. For a fraction of a second, I remembered the little girl who used to hold my hand while we walked through the park on Sunday afternoons. But that little girl was a ghost. The woman crying at my feet was a treacherous stranger who had planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward just hours ago. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe her tears. I pulled out a folded stack of heavily highlighted banking statements. "Let her go," I instructed the bailiffs who were stepping forward to pull Naomi off my legs. "I want her to hear this up close." I unfolded the bank statements and let them drop from my hand. The pages fluttered down slowly, landing on the floor right in front of Naomi's tear-stained face. I looked down at her and spoke in a voice so incredibly cold it could freeze boiling water. "You blame your husband for your overwhelming greed, Naomi," I said, making sure every syllable rang clear across the room. "You claim he manipulated you into stealing my real estate. But Bradley had absolutely nothing to do with these bank records. These transactions belong entirely and exclusively to you." Naomi looked down at the highlighted papers scattered on the floor. Her fake dramatic sobbing stopped instantly. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a chalk statue. Her entire body went totally rigid. I lifted my gaze and addressed the judge, ensuring my words became part of the official court record. 5 years ago, Your Honor, when my beautiful wife Clarice lost her brutal battle with breast cancer, I established the Clarice Pierce Memorial Cancer Foundation. I funded it with $2 million of my own hard-earned money. The sole purpose of that charitable foundation was to pay for the expensive chemotherapy treatments of underprivileged black women in the south side of Atlanta who could not afford medical care. I made Naomi the executive director of that foundation because I thought it would help her heal from the loss of her mother. I trusted her to honor her mother's memory. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the courtroom. Everyone knew that something terrible was about to be revealed. I looked back down at the woman still kneeling at my feet. "Instead of honoring your mother," I continued, my voice vibrating with a deep, crushing sorrow and an unyielding rage, "you used her cancer charity as your personal piggy bank." The courtroom gasped collectively. The judge leaned far over her heavy wooden bench, her eyes wide with absolute horror and rising fury. I pointed my wooden cane directly at the scattered bank statements on the floor. In the last 18 months, Naomi has embezzled over $400,000 directly from the charity accounts. She took the money meant to save dying women and she used it to buy herself 3 Hermes Birkin bags, a brand new luxury SUV, and a first-class vacation to the Maldives. She literally stole the legacy of her own dead mother to fund her pathetic, superficial lifestyle. While women in my community suffered and died because the foundation mysteriously ran out of funds, my daughter was buying designer shoes. Naomi slowly let go of my legs. She shrank back, pressing her hands against her mouth, trembling like a trapped rat. She could not speak. She could not formulate a single lie to save herself. She knew there was absolutely no way out. The proof was lying right there in black and white for the entire world to see. "You were not deceived, Naomi," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "You were never a victim. You were going to sell your own father to a psychiatric ward just to maintain your fake life of luxury. You sold your soul a long time ago, and you are exactly where you belong." The judge had heard enough. Her face was flushed with pure, righteous anger. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a violent, cracking force that sounded like a gunshot. "Bailiffs," the judge commanded, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable fury. "I want these 2 individuals placed in handcuffs right this second. I am ordering the immediate emergency arrest of Bradley Sterling and Naomi Sterling for federal fraud, embezzlement of a charitable foundation, and conspiracy to defraud and abuse an elderly citizen. There will be absolutely no bail set at this time. Take them out of my sight." The bailiffs moved forward. The sound of their heavy boots tapping against the polished floor felt like a ticking clock marking the absolute end of Bradley's life. One officer reached out and grabbed his arm, preparing to snap the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. But desperation is a powerful fuel. Bradley violently wrenched his shoulder free, stepping back and slamming his hand onto the defense table. He was panting like a dying dog, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He looked up at the judge and screamed that the arrest order was illegal. He claimed the entire financial transfer, including the massive toxic debt from the Environmental Protection Agency, was totally null and void. The courtroom froze. The judge raised an eyebrow, holding her heavy wooden gavel in midair, and demanded that Bradley explain his outburst before she held him in contempt of court. Bradley reached a shaking hand into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick medical paper bearing the official letterhead of a highly exclusive private psychiatric clinic in Atlanta. He waved it in the air like a white flag of salvation. He told the judge that the document was a certified psychiatric evaluation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had been suffering from advanced severe dementia for over 6 months. He claimed that because my brain was legally deteriorating, I lacked the mental capacity to execute any legal contracts, including the Trojan Horse subsidiary transfer I had tricked him into signing yesterday. He argued that since I was legally incompetent, the toxic debt remained mine, and the original transfer of my primary wealth was still valid. He thought he had found the perfect legal loophole to escape the trap. Naomi wiped her face, sitting up slightly in her chair. The greedy, treacherous hope returned to her eyes. She thought her husband had just saved them from federal prison. Bradley turned toward the gallery and called out to a man sitting quietly in the back row. He called for Dr. Eris Thorne to approach the bench. A tall, thin white man wearing an expensive tweed suit and wire-rimmed glasses stood up. He walked down the center aisle carrying a leather portfolio, trying to project an aura of absolute medical authority. Dr. Thorne took the witness stand. He spoke in a smooth, highly educated tone that was designed to make people trust him blindly. He stated for the official record that he had reviewed my medical history and conducted a series of stealth cognitive assessments over the past few weeks at Bradley's request. Dr. Thorne looked at the judge with a fake sympathetic expression. He testified that I was suffering from rapid onset cognitive decline. He used complex medical terminology describing microscopic brain degeneration and severe memory fragmentation. He concluded his completely fabricated testimony by stating that any legal document signed by Donovan Pierce in the last 6 months was entirely invalid because my mind was essentially gone. Bradley stood at the defense table, smiling a smug, sickening smile. He crossed his arms over his chest, thinking his highly paid corrupt doctor had just effectively reversed the $27 million death sentence hanging over his head. He thought he had successfully weaponized the medical system against a black man, just like corrupt officials used to do in the old days. I did not panic. I did not shout that the doctor was a liar. Back in the 1980s, when I was securing the permits to build my first massive logistics warehouse, a crooked city inspector tried to use fake environmental reports to extort me out of a 50% ownership stake. I learned a very valuable lesson that year. You never argue with a liar. You simply let them build their house of cards, and then you bring out the flamethrower. I leaned heavily on my wooden cane and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. The judge looked down at me and asked if my legal counsel had any cross-examination or any response to this devastating medical evaluation. Lincoln, my towering corporate lawyer, simply smiled, stepped aside, and gestured for me to take the floor. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out the small silver storage drive I had been gripping since I overheard them plotting in the hallway this morning. I walked over to the court clerk's desk. I told the judge that a man who spends his entire life building an empire in a world designed to crush him learns to never leave his blind spots unprotected. I asked the judge for permission to submit a digital audio file into the official court record. I explained that it was a recording directly related to the medical evaluation Dr. Thorne had just presented under oath. The judge narrowed her eyes, sensing the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. She nodded and instructed the court technician to plug my storage drive into the primary audio-visual system of the courtroom. The technician took the small silver drive and inserted it into the computer terminal. A second later, the massive high-definition speakers mounted on the courtroom walls hissed with a brief burst of static. Then the audio file began to play. The sound quality was incredibly crisp and clear. It was a recording taken from a hidden microphone I had installed in the decorative planter sitting right on my own front porch. The entire courtroom fell deathly silent as two very distinct voices echoed through the room. One voice belonged to Bradley. The other voice belonged to the very same tweed-suited medical professional, currently sitting in the witness stand. The recorded voice of Bradley echoed off the oak walls. He sounded impatient and entirely ruthless. "How much is it going to take to get this done by Tuesday?" Thorne Bradley asked on the recording. "I need a bulletproof psychiatric evaluation stating the old man is completely senile. It has to be airtight enough to hold up in probate court when I take over his commercial assets." The recorded voice of Dr. Thorne replied without a single shred of medical ethics. "A retroactive dementia diagnosis is highly risky," Bradley the doctor said smoothly. "If the medical board audits my files, I could lose my license. I need $50,000 in unmarked cash transferred to my offshore account by tomorrow morning, and I need a guarantee that he will not be in a position to contest the diagnosis." The courtroom was completely paralyzed. The jury box, the gallery, and the judge were all frozen in absolute horror. But the recording was not finished. The most damning part of the conversation was about to be broadcast to the world. "I will double your fee," Bradley said, his recorded voice dripping with pure evil. I will give you $100,000 if you process the emergency medical transfer yourself. I want him locked in your psychiatric facility by tomorrow afternoon. Put him in a maximum security solitary confinement ward. Keep him heavily sedated. I do not want him talking to any outside lawyers or making any phone calls. I want him to completely disappear inside your hospital. Done, Dr. Thorne replied coldly. The paperwork will be signed and ready. The audio file ended with a sharp click. The heavy, crushing silence that followed was more deafening than a bomb explosion. Every single eye in the courtroom slowly turned toward the witness stand. Dr. Eris Thorne was sitting completely frozen in his chair. All the blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, lifeless corpse. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The expensive tweed suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. He realized he had just committed federal perjury in open court, and his explicit conspiracy to kidnap and drug an elderly man for money had just been played for a federal judge. The heavy wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block with a violent, deafening crack that made everyone in the gallery jump. The judge pounded the wooden hammer again and again as if she was trying to physically shatter the pure evil that had just been exposed in her courtroom. "Order!" she shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute disgust and righteous fury. "Bailiffs, secure this room immediately and lock those doors. No one leaves this chamber." She glared down at Dr. Thorne, who was visibly shaking in the witness stand, his expensive tweed suit now looking completely ridiculous on his trembling frame. "You are under arrest for federal perjury and criminal conspiracy," she told him coldly, her eyes burning with judicial wrath. "I am referring your medical license to the State Board for immediate and permanent revocation, and you will be facing severe federal prison time for attempting to falsely commit a perfectly sane man." The corrupt doctor buried his face in his trembling hands, weeping loudly like a broken child. Bradley and Naomi were frozen at the defense table. The courtroom, which they had gleefully walked into this morning thinking it was a quiet slaughterhouse for a confused old man, had rapidly transformed into their own public execution ground. All of their elaborate schemes, their forged documents, and their fake tears were completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of the absolute truth. I walked slowly toward the center podium. My wooden cane tapped a steady, commanding rhythm on the polished floor, sounding like the final countdown of their miserable lives. I did not look at the judge or the shocked faces in the jury box. I locked my eyes entirely on the pale, pathetic man sitting next to my weeping daughter. Bradley could not even meet my gaze. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, completely stripped of the unearned, arrogant privilege he had paraded around for the last 15 years. I placed my calloused hands on the edges of the solid oak podium. I spoke, and my voice was not loud, but it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a man who had survived a lifetime of brutal battles. I told Bradley that he made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He looked at me and only saw a tired, old black man who was ready to be pushed aside. He thought my quiet demeanor was weakness and my patience was stupidity. I made sure every single person in that silent room heard the history he had tried to erase. I told them about the harsh reality of Atlanta that I grew up in. I told them about the 1970s when a young black man trying to start a simple logistics company could not even get a meeting at a downtown bank, let alone a commercial loan. I told them how I hauled heavy freight for 16 hours a day, sleeping in the freezing cab of my truck because the motels on the highway would not rent a room to someone with my skin color. I bled for every single dollar I ever made. I fought through systemic redlining, corrupt city officials, and blatant racism that was specifically designed to keep men like me sweeping floors instead of owning high-rise buildings. I built a massive commercial empire from the absolute dirt up, using nothing but my bare hands and a mind that flatly refused to be broken by a rigged system. I built it alongside my beautiful late wife, Clarice, so my family would never have to experience the indignity of begging for a seat at the table. I gave Naomi a life of absolute luxury and endless privilege, and she turned around and handed that legacy to a mediocre, arrogant man who felt entirely entitled to my fortune simply because he was born with pale skin and a fake country club pedigree. I told Bradley that his entire life was a pathetic fraud. He was born on third base and spent his whole miserable life acting like he hit a massive home run. He thought he could stroll into my life, flash a fake smile, use some complicated financial jargon, and take everything I bled for over 4 decades. I told him he was nothing but a useless parasite feeding on the hard work of far better men, and I swore before God and everyone in that courtroom that I would completely burn my own empire to ashes and scatter them in the wind before I ever let a worthless, arrogant coward like him inherit a single brick of my legacy. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ragged, uneven breathing of my daughter. Naomi was clutching her arms, rocking back and forth in a state of total emotional collapse. She was crying out for her mother, claiming that Clarice would never let this happen. I told her that Clarice would be deeply ashamed to see the monster her daughter had become. She had traded her soul for a lifestyle she could not even afford. The gallery behind me murmured in agreement. People were shaking their heads at the absolute audacity of this treacherous couple. The judge looked at me with profound, deep respect before turning her fierce, unwavering gaze back to the defense table. She announced that based on the irrefutable audio evidence, the verified financial records, and the horrifying attempted embezzlement of a cancer charity, she was ordering the immediate emergency arrest of Bradley Sterling and Naomi Sterling. The heavy thudding footsteps of the bailiffs echoed across the silent room. They marched directly to the defense table and grabbed Bradley by his tailored shoulders, hauling him roughly and violently to his feet. They did the exact same thing to Naomi, completely ignoring her pathetic wails for mercy and her desperate apologies. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around their wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had heard in 5 years. They were totally defeated, their false empire completely destroyed by their own bottomless greed. They were dragging Bradley toward the side exit of the courtroom. He was thrashing weakly against the massive arms of the bailiffs, his face completely drained of any hope or arrogant pride. He looked like a hollow shell of a human being, sweating so much his expensive suit was entirely ruined. Just as they reached the heavy wooden doors, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the tense, quiet atmosphere. It was coming from Bradley's suit jacket pocket. His cell phone was ringing, vibrating wildly against his chest. The bailiff stopped walking and patted him down, pulling the glowing device from his pocket. Lincoln, my towering corporate lawyer, stepped forward with a dark, knowing smile and calmly took the phone from the officer's hand. Lincoln looked at the caller identification on the screen, and his smile grew even wider. He pressed the button to answer the call and activated the loudspeaker, holding the phone high in the air so the judge, the gallery, and the terrified prisoners could hear every single word. The voice that echoed out of the small speaker did not belong to a friendly bank manager or a concerned high society friend. It was a deep, rough, gravelly voice that carried the terrifying, undeniable promise of extreme violence. "Time is completely up, Bradley," the rough voice announced casually over the speaker. "We are sitting in your expensive living room right now, admiring your nice furniture. We brought a few friends with us to collect our $12 million. We are waiting right here for you to come home." The echoing voice of the loan shark on the speakerphone sent a final wave of terror through Bradley as he was dragged out of the courtroom. Lincoln ended the call and handed the phone to the police evidence clerk. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only the heavy silence of justice finally being served. I walked out of the massive oak doors with Lincoln walking just a step behind me. The cold air of the Atlanta afternoon hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing. I had just amputated the rotting branches of my own family tree. It was a painful emotional surgery, but the toxic disease of their greed was finally gone. However, men like Lincoln and I knew that the poison Bradley had invited into our lives was not completely eradicated just yet. $12 million in underground criminal debt does not simply disappear because a judge bangs a gavel and sends a man to a holding cell. Those loan sharks did not care about federal indictments or toxic waste liabilities. They only cared about green cash, and they knew exactly who actually had the deep pockets to pay them off. As we walked down the grand steps of the courthouse to my waiting luxury sedan, Lincoln looked at me with a very serious expression. He told me that the men Bradley owed were not Wall Street bankers playing with spreadsheets and legal threats. They were a violent, ruthless syndicate operating out of the dark shadows of the city. I simply nodded and told my private driver to take us back to my primary estate in Buckhead. I knew the gang members would not wait at Bradley's empty leased penthouse for long. Once they saw the breaking afternoon news of his spectacular public arrest, they would trace the money straight to its actual source. They would come to my home thinking they could intimidate a 73-year-old grieving father into opening his massive checkbook to save his family name from a violent end. My driver steered the heavy armored sedan through the tall wrought iron gates of my primary estate. The property was a sprawling, magnificent testament to 40 years of absolute relentless grind and sacrifice. But as the tires crunched along the long, winding gravel driveway, I saw that my peaceful sanctuary had been violently invaded. Parked recklessly across my perfectly manicured front lawn, destroying the green grass, were two battered dark pickup trucks and a customized luxury SUV with tinted windows. Standing on my wide front porch, leaning against the pristine white pillars like they owned the place, was a group of 5 heavily tattooed white men. They wore thick leather jackets and carried the unmistakable, arrogant posture of men who were entirely used to using brutal physical violence to get whatever they wanted. They were smoking cheap cigarettes and carelessly flicking the burning ashes onto my clean stone steps. I told my driver to stop the car a few yards away from the front porch. Lincoln reached inside his tailored midnight blue jacket, unbuttoning it slightly to free up his movement, but I put a calm, steady hand on his shoulder. I told my oldest friend to let me handle this one personally. I opened my heavy car door and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, playing the role of the vulnerable senior citizen one last time. The leader of the group slowly walked down the stone steps. He was a massive, hulking man with a thick, unkempt beard and a dark, jagged scar running down the side of his thick neck. He looked at me with the exact same dismissive, arrogant contempt that my son-in-law Bradley had always used. He saw an old black man with a wooden cane and immediately calculated that I was soft, vulnerable, and easily broken by a few loud threats. "Well, look who finally decided to come home," the scarred leader said, his rough, gravelly voice echoing aggressively across my quiet front yard. "You must be the famous Donovan Pierce. Your pathetic coward of a son-in-law Bradley owes my employers a very large sum of money, $12 million in cold hard cash to be exact. We were waiting comfortably at his shiny little penthouse, but we just saw on the news that the feds scooped him and your daughter up for fraud. Now normally when a rat goes to prison, we take our frustration out on his pretty wife. But since she is locked up too, that leaves you, Grandpa, to settle the family tab." The leader took a few heavy steps closer, completely invading my personal space, trying to use his massive physical size to intimidate me. He blew a thick cloud of foul cigarette smoke directly into my face. I did not blink. I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still, leaning on my cane, staring dead into his cold, lifeless eyes. "Your son-in-law was supposed to hand over the legal deed to this beautiful property today." The gang leader continued, his tone growing increasingly hostile and loud. "Since that did not happen, you are going to write us a cashier check for the full $12 million right now. If you refuse, we are going to walk inside your pretty house and start breaking every single bone in your old, frail body. Then we are going to burn this massive, beautiful legacy of yours straight to the ground. You have exactly 1 minute to decide if you want to die on your own front lawn today, old man." The thugs standing on the porch laughed loudly, pulling heavy steel crowbars and heavy brass knuckles from inside their leather jackets. They slapped the metal weapons against their palms, trying to create a terrifying rhythm. They genuinely thought this was a simple neighborhood shakedown. They thought they had cornered a helpless civilian who would simply empty his bank accounts out of sheer mortal terror. I let out a slow, deep sigh. I looked up at the scarred gang leader and told him that he had made the exact same fatal miscalculation as the absolute fool who owed him money. I told him that I did not build a multi-billion-dollar logistics and real estate empire by backing down from cheap street thugs who think a few neck tattoos and loud threats make them powerful. I told him that I survived the most ruthless, vicious, and racially hostile eras of this city, and I did not survive them by being a victim who hands over his lunch money. The gang leader scoffed aggressively, raising his massive, heavy hand to shove me backward onto the gravel. He never even got the chance to touch the fabric of my coat. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers with a sharp, loud crack. Before the echo of my snap even faded into the air, the heavy iron gates at the very end of my long driveway slammed shut with a deafening metallic boom, automatically locking them inside my property. Suddenly, the roaring heavy diesel engines of 3 massive black bulletproof tactical SUVs erupted from the concealed service roads behind my mansion. They tore aggressively across the grass, kicking up dirt and surrounding the gang members, completely cutting off any possible chance of escape. The heavy armored doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. 24 highly trained, heavily armed private security contractors stepped out in perfect synchronization. They raised sophisticated automatic weapons, bringing them to their shoulders, and aiming 24 glowing red laser sights directly at the chests and foreheads of the 5 terrified thugs. The gang leader froze completely, his raised hand hovering uselessly in the air. His face turned the color of wet chalk as he realized he had just brought a crowbar to a highly coordinated tactical ambush. The heavy steel weapons slipped from the hands of the men on the porch, hitting the stone driveway with a pathetic clatter. They threw their hands high into the air, absolutely paralyzed by the overwhelming display of lethal force. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit coat, pulled out a thick manila folder, and threw it directly into the dirt at the feet of the trembling gang leader. The manila folder landed in the dirt right next to the heavy scuffed combat boots of the gang leader. The loud metallic clicks of 24 automatic rifles being loaded and aimed at their chests echoed across my perfectly manicured front lawn. The red laser sights painted their foreheads and their chests like a dozen glowing target markers. The arrogant smirks that had been plastered across their faces just 10 seconds ago vanished completely. The heavy brass knuckles and the crowbars they had brought to beat an old man to death were now useless pieces of metal lying in the gravel. I leaned forward on my wooden cane. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who held the absolute power of life and death in his hands. I told the scarred leader to reach down and pick up the folder. I told him to move very slowly so my security contractors would not mistake a sudden flinch for a hostile action. The massive, hulking man swallowed hard. The thick, jagged scar on his neck throbbed as his heart pounded violently against his ribs. He bent down his knees, actually trembling, and picked up the thick manila envelope from the dirt. He brushed off the dust and opened the flap. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the profound confusion morph into sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked up at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, entirely unable to comprehend what he was holding. I decided to explain it to him so there would be absolutely no misunderstanding between us. I told him that when I found out my pathetic son-in-law owed $12 million to a violent underground syndicate, I did not panic. I did not run to the police, and I certainly did not start writing checks to buy his safety. Instead, I called my corporate lawyer Lincoln, and we unleashed a team of elite forensic accountants to find out exactly who was holding Bradley's leash. I told the gang leader that street thugs always make the exact same fatal mistake. They think physical violence is the ultimate form of power. They think breaking legs and burning houses makes them kings of the city. But real power, the kind of absolute untouchable power that I built over 4 decades in Atlanta, does not need to throw a single punch. Real power is paper. Real power is ownership. Real power is knowing exactly where your enemies sleep and exactly how to bankrupt them before they even wake up. I pointed my wooden cane at the documents trembling in his massive hands. I told him to look at the second page. It was a master commercial lease agreement. I explained that I knew his syndicate operated out of a massive industrial warehouse and nightclub complex on the east side of the city. I knew they used it as a heavily guarded fortress to run their illegal operations and launder their dirty cash. What they did not know was the name of the holding company that owned that entire industrial block. The gang leader looked down at the lease agreement. His eyes locked onto the landlord's signature line. The property was owned by Pierce Legacy Group. "You are standing on my lawn threatening to burn my house down," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "But you do not even realize that you are currently standing inside a building that I fully own. I am your landlord. I hold the master lease to your entire operation. With one single phone call, I can have the city shut off your water, your electricity, and your commercial access. I can have you legally evicted and thrown out onto the street by tomorrow morning." The gang leader took a shaky step back. The cheap cigarette he had been smoking fell from his lips and hit the gravel. But I was not finished dismantling his entire existence. I told him to look at the third page. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as he saw the highly classified financial routing numbers, the offshore shell company accounts, and the completely fabricated import and export invoices his syndicate used to wash their illegal drug and extortion money. My forensic accountants had effortlessly cracked their primitive financial shielding in less than 48 hours. I told him that I had every single ledger, every single fake transaction, and every single name associated with his syndicate printed out in high-definition color inside that folder. I told him that the folder he was holding was just a copy. The original encrypted files were sitting on a secure server in Lincoln's law office, guarded by the best cybersecurity experts in the state of Georgia. "Bradley Sterling is a dead man walking," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality across the quiet lawn. "He is currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing 25 years for massive wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. He is no longer my son-in-law. He is no longer a part of my family. I have completely cut him off and let him burn to ashes. If he owes you $12 million, you can go down to the federal penitentiary and ask him to pay you from his commissary account. But you will never ever come to my property looking for his money again." The gang members standing on the porch behind him were completely paralyzed. They were surrounded by heavily armed military-grade contractors, and their boss had just been financially and legally castrated by an old black man with a wooden cane. I looked directly into the scarred leader's eyes. I made sure he felt the absolute crushing weight of my authority. I told him that if he ever drove down my street again, if he ever approached any of my properties, or if he ever even breathed my name in public, I would not send my security team to shoot him. That would be too quick and far too merciful. I told him that I would press one single button on my desk. I would send the entire contents of that folder directly to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the head of the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I would have their bank accounts permanently frozen. I would have their properties seized by the federal government. I would strip them of every single dime they had ever stolen and let them rot in a concrete cage for the rest of their miserable lives, just like Bradley. The gang leader was sweating heavily. The tough street thug facade had completely melted away. He was holding a loaded gun to his own head, and he knew that I had my finger resting firmly on the trigger. He carefully, slowly closed the manila folder. He did not say a single word. There was absolutely nothing left to say. He looked at the dozen red laser dots still glowing brightly on his chest. "I give you exactly 5 minutes to get off my lawn," I commanded, my voice cracking like a heavy whip across the yard. "If your trucks are not past those iron gates by the time my watch ticks 5 minutes, I will freeze your entire operation tonight and send the feds to your doorstep before the sun comes up. Get out of my sight." I snapped my fingers one more time. The heavily armed private security contractors simultaneously took one synchronized step backward, lowering their weapons just a fraction of an inch to clear a path, but keeping their eyes locked firmly on the targets. The heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway began to slowly swing open. The gang leader did not hesitate for a single second. He spun around and sprinted toward his customized luxury vehicle. The other 4 thugs scrambled off my front porch, tripping over each other in sheer absolute panic. They dove into their battered pickup trucks, slamming the doors shut. The roaring engines of their vehicles sputtered and screamed as they slammed their heavy boots onto the gas pedals. They tore down my gravel driveway, kicking up massive clouds of dust and dirt, fleeing my property like terrified rats escaping a sinking ship. I stood on the stone steps of my porch, leaning on my wooden cane, and watched them disappear down the street. The heavy iron gate slammed shut behind them, locking with a loud, satisfying mechanical click. Lincoln stepped up beside me, letting out a low, appreciative breath. The tactical vehicles reversed silently back into the concealed service roads, returning to their hidden positions. The front yard was completely quiet once again. The absolute order of my empire had been fully and mercilessly restored. It had been exactly 7 days since the heavy iron doors of the federal detention center slammed shut on my daughter and her arrogant husband. The massive estate in Buckhead was incredibly quiet now. The toxic energy that had suffocated my home for months was completely gone. I spent my mornings drinking black coffee on the patio, watching the sunrise and feeling a profound sense of peace. But I knew the final piece of garbage still needed to be taken out to the curb. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. The automated voice operator announced a collect call from an inmate at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. I pressed the button to accept the charges. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the desperate, hyperventilating sobs echoing through the receiver. Naomi begged me to come see her. She cried that she was terrified and that she could not survive another night in a concrete cell. I told her I would be there in exactly 1 hour, and then I hung up the phone. I put on a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, the exact kind of suit I wore when negotiating multi-million-dollar logistics contracts. I wanted her to see the powerful businessman she tried to destroy, not the frail old father she thought she could easily manipulate and lock away. My driver took me to the federal facility on the outskirts of the city. The drive gave me time to reflect on the decades of sacrifice I had made for a child who ultimately viewed me as an expiring asset. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and the cold, sterile hallways of the maximum security prison. The air inside smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and pure despair. It was a place designed to break the human spirit, and I knew my daughter had a very fragile spirit built entirely on stolen money and fake prestige. I sat at a cold steel table in the center of the stark white visitation room. A heavy metal door opened on the other side of the thick, reinforced glass partition. A female guard escorted Naomi into the room. I almost did not recognize the woman walking toward me. The glamorous high society socialite was completely gone. Her expensive hair extensions were matted and tangled, falling limply around her shoulders. Her skin was pale and deeply exhausted, completely stripped of the expensive cosmetics she used to hide her ugly, treacherous soul. She was wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. Her wrists looked incredibly thin without her stolen diamond bracelets. She looked exactly like what she was, a common criminal who had finally been caught by the absolute reality of her actions. Naomi sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me. She picked up the black plastic telephone receiver with violently trembling hands. I picked up my receiver and looked her dead in the eye. She immediately launched into a hysterical, theatrical performance. She pressed her tear-stained face against the thick, reinforced glass, leaving wet smudges on the clear surface. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully through the phone speaker. "Dad, you have to get me out of this place. This place is an absolute nightmare. The food is disgusting, the guards are cruel, and the other inmates are terrifying. You have to pay my bail today. I know the federal judge denied it initially because of the flight risk, but your corporate lawyers can fix this. You have the money. You can afford the best defense team in the state of Georgia. Please, Dad, I am begging you on my knees to save me." I sat perfectly still, holding the receiver, resting my other hand firmly on the handle of my wooden cane. I did not show a single ounce of pity. I did not offer a warm smile or a word of comfort. Naomi saw my blank expression and immediately shifted her tactic, trying to use the deepest emotional weapon she had left in her arsenal. She told me that I could not leave her in this concrete cage because she was my only child. She cried that she was my flesh and blood. She invoked the sacred memory of my late wife, telling me that Clarice would be absolutely heartbroken to see her little girl locked away like a caged animal. She sobbed that family is supposed to protect each other no matter what terrible mistakes are made along the way. I let her cry until she ran completely out of breath. The silence stretched between us, heavy, cold, and completely unforgiving. I leaned forward slightly and spoke directly into the receiver. My voice was steady and colder than the concrete floor beneath our feet. I told her that she lost the absolute right to speak her mother's name the very moment she stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a cancer charity meant to save dying black women. I told her that she took the beautiful legacy of Clarice Pierce and turned it into designer handbags, luxury vehicles, and first-class vacations to tropical islands. I told her that she did not make a simple mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay an electric bill or running a red light, plotting to drug your own father, forging fake psychiatric evaluations, and planning to lock him inside a maximum security mental ward so you can steal his real estate is not a mistake. It is calculated pure evil. Naomi shook her head wildly, denying it, blaming Bradley again, claiming she was just a weak victim who blindly followed her abusive husband. I told her to stop insulting my intelligence. I told her I heard the hidden audio recordings. I heard her complaining about my rambling stories. I heard her eagerly anticipating my forced confinement. I heard her say she could not spend another week pretending to care about me. I told her that the only thing she was actually sorry about was getting caught and losing her fake wealthy lifestyle. She did not regret the betrayal, she only regretted the severe consequences. She pressed her hands against the glass tears streaming down her face, begging for one more chance. She swore she would change. She promised she would be the devoted daughter I always wanted if I just wrote a check to get her out of that awful place. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a single crisp legal document prepared by my lawyer Lincoln. I slid the thick paper through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the security glass. Naomi looked down at the document, her red swollen eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the bold heading printed at the top. It was a formal legal declaration of disownment and a complete severing of all familial and financial ties. It explicitly removed her from my will, my trusts, and any future inheritance. It legally reduced her to a complete stranger. I looked into her terrified eyes one last time. I told her that she should have remembered that we were flesh and blood before she planned to pump my veins full of heavy sedatives and steal the empire I bled on the streets of Atlanta to build. I told her to sign the paper and pay the ultimate brutal price for her own boundless greed. I hung the black plastic receiver back on the heavy metal wall hook. I did not wait for her answer. I stood up, straightened my tailored jacket, turned my back on the glass partition, and walked slowly out of the visitation room. I walked back out into the bright, warm sunlight of the city, completely ignoring the hollow, agonizing echoes of my daughter's hysterical screams trapped forever behind the thick steel doors. It had been exactly 7 days since the heavy iron doors of the federal detention center slammed shut on my daughter and her arrogant husband. The massive estate in Buckhead was incredibly quiet now. The toxic energy that had suffocated my home for months was completely gone. I spent my mornings drinking black coffee on the patio, watching the sunrise and feeling a profound sense of peace. But I knew the final piece of garbage still needed to be taken out to the curb. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. The automated voice operator announced a collect call from an inmate at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. I pressed the button to accept the charges. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the desperate, hyperventilating sobs echoing through the receiver. Naomi begged me to come see her. She cried that she was terrified and that she could not survive another night in a concrete cell. I told her I would be there in exactly 1 hour, and then I hung up the phone. I put on a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, the exact kind of suit I wore when negotiating multi-million-dollar logistics contracts. I wanted her to see the powerful businessman she tried to destroy, not the frail old father she thought she could easily manipulate and lock away. My driver took me to the federal facility on the outskirts of the city. The drive gave me time to reflect on the decades of sacrifice I had made for a child who ultimately viewed me as an expiring asset. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and the cold, sterile hallways of the maximum security prison. The air inside smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and pure despair. It was a place designed to break the human spirit, and I knew my daughter had a very fragile spirit built entirely on stolen money and fake prestige. I sat at a cold steel table in the center of the stark white visitation room. A heavy metal door opened on the other side of the thick, reinforced glass partition. A female guard escorted Naomi into the room. I almost did not recognize the woman walking toward me. The glamorous high society socialite was completely gone. Her expensive hair extensions were matted and tangled, falling limply around her shoulders. Her skin was pale and deeply exhausted, completely stripped of the expensive cosmetics she used to hide her ugly, treacherous soul. She was wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. Her wrists looked incredibly thin without her stolen diamond bracelets. She looked exactly like what she was, a common criminal who had finally been caught by the absolute reality of her actions. Naomi sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me. She picked up the black plastic telephone receiver with violently trembling hands. I picked up my receiver and looked her dead in the eye. She immediately launched into a hysterical theatrical performance. She pressed her tear-stained face against the thick, reinforced glass, leaving wet smudges on the clear surface. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully through the phone speaker. "Dad, you have to get me out of this place. This place is an absolute nightmare. The food is disgusting. The guards are cruel and the other inmates are terrifying. You have to pay my bail today. I know the federal judge denied it initially because of the flight risk, but your corporate lawyers can fix this. You have the money. You can afford the best defense team in the state of Georgia. Please, Dad, I am begging you on my knees to save me." I sat perfectly still, holding the receiver, resting my other hand firmly on the handle of my wooden cane. I did not show a single ounce of pity. I did not offer a warm smile or a word of comfort. Naomi saw my blank expression and immediately shifted her tactic, trying to use the deepest emotional weapon she had left in her arsenal. She told me that I could not leave her in this concrete cage because she was my only child. She cried that she was my flesh and blood. She invoked the sacred memory of my late wife, telling me that Clarice would be absolutely heartbroken to see her little girl locked away like a caged animal. She sobbed that family is supposed to protect each other no matter what terrible mistakes are made along the way. I let her cry until she ran completely out of breath. The silence stretched between us, heavy, cold, and completely unforgiving. I leaned forward slightly and spoke directly into the receiver. My voice was steady and colder than the concrete floor beneath our feet. I told her that she lost the absolute right to speak her mother's name the very moment she stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a cancer charity meant to save dying black women. I told her that she took the beautiful legacy of Clarice Pierce and turned it into designer handbags, luxury vehicles, and first-class vacations to tropical islands. I told her that she did not make a simple mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay an electric bill or running a red light. Plotting to drug your own father, forging fake psychiatric evaluations, and planning to lock him inside a maximum security mental ward so you can steal his real estate is not a mistake. It is calculated pure evil. Naomi shook her head wildly, denying it, blaming Bradley again, claiming she was just a weak victim who blindly followed her abusive husband. I told her to stop insulting my intelligence. I told her I heard the hidden audio recordings. I heard her complaining about my rambling stories. I heard her eagerly anticipating my forced confinement. I heard her say she could not spend another week pretending to care about me. I told her that the only thing she was actually sorry about was getting caught and losing her fake wealthy lifestyle. She did not regret the betrayal, she only regretted the severe consequences. She pressed her hands against the glass tears streaming down her face, begging for one more chance. She swore she would change. She promised she would be the devoted daughter I always wanted if I just wrote a check to get her out of that awful place. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a single, crisp legal document prepared by my lawyer, Lincoln. I slid the thick paper through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the security glass. Naomi looked down at the document, her red, swollen eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the bold heading printed at the top. It was a formal legal declaration of disownment and a complete severing of all familial and financial ties. It explicitly removed her from my will, my trusts, and any future inheritance. It legally reduced her to a complete stranger. I looked into her terrified eyes one last time. I told her that she should have remembered that we were flesh and blood before she planned to pump my veins full of heavy sedatives and steal the empire I bled on the streets of Atlanta to build. I told her to sign the paper and pay the ultimate brutal price for her own boundless greed. I hung the black plastic receiver back on the heavy metal wall hook. I did not wait for her answer. I stood up, straightened my tailored jacket, turned my back on the glass partition, and walked slowly out of the visitation room. I walked back out into the bright, warm sunlight of the city, completely ignoring the hollow, agonizing echoes of my daughter's hysterical screams trapped forever behind the thick steel doors. The quiet peace of my Buckhead estate was a welcome comfort after the emotional storm of cutting off my only daughter, but the grand finale of my absolute vengeance had not yet concluded. Naomi was weeping in a concrete cell, completely stripped of her designer identity, but her arrogant husband, Bradley Sterling, still harbored a dangerous delusion. He was sitting in the Federal Holding Center, desperately clinging to the belief that his country club pedigree, his smooth vocabulary, and his pale skin would somehow grant him a miraculous escape. Men like Bradley have gone their entire lives failing upward, protected by a society that constantly cushions their falls. He genuinely believed he could simply charm a judge or hire a miracle worker to twist the law in his favor. I decided it was time to teach him a permanent lesson about the brutal, unforgiving nature of real power. When you build an untouchable commercial empire from the dirt of Atlanta, you do not just accumulate money. You accumulate massive, undeniable gravity. I called my oldest friend and corporate lawyer Lincoln into my study and poured us both a glass of dark-aged bourbon. I told Lincoln that I wanted to ensure Bradley felt the absolute crushing weight of the justice system without a single protective shield. The federal government had already frozen all of Bradley's personal and corporate bank accounts under the grand jury indictment for massive wire fraud and elder abuse. He had absolutely zero liquid cash. But desperate men will promise future equity, they will promise favors, and they will lie through their teeth to secure high-powered legal defense. I was not going to leave anything to chance. Lincoln smiled his signature cold, predatory smile and went to work. He did not do anything illegal. We did not have to break a single law to completely suffocate Bradley's legal options. Lincoln simply made a series of quiet, polite phone calls to every single top-tier criminal defense firm in the state of Georgia. The message was incredibly simple and devastatingly effective. Lincoln politely informed the managing partners that Bradley Sterling had attempted to steal from the Pierce Legacy Group and had conspired to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He casually mentioned that any law firm choosing to represent Mr. Sterling on credit would be viewed as actively betting against our commercial empire. In the ruthless corporate ecosystem of Atlanta, nobody wants to be on the bad side of a billionaire who owns half the commercial real estate in the city. The result was instantaneous and absolute. Every single high-priced, aggressive defense attorney suddenly became entirely unavailable. They refused to return his frantic phone calls from the detention center. They denied his requests for a consultation. Bradley, the arrogant hedge fund manager who used to brag about having the best lawyers on speed dial, was completely blacklisted by his own elite circle. He was ultimately forced to accept a state-appointed public defender. His assigned lawyer was a young, deeply exhausted man who was juggling 90 other felony cases and had absolutely zero sympathy for a privileged white-collar criminal who tried to rob an elderly black man. Bradley was entirely defenseless. With his legal options completely neutralized, Bradley was subjected to the harsh, terrifying reality of the criminal justice system. Because of the sheer severity of his charges, including conspiracy to commit first-degree murder by forced medical sedation, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk and transferred him to the maximum security holding block at the county jail. This was not a minimum security white-collar facility with tennis courts and library privileges. This was a brutal, unforgiving concrete fortress filled with hardened men who had survived the very streets Bradley used to look down upon from his luxury penthouse. I received detailed updates from Lincoln's contacts inside the facility. The transformation of Bradley Sterling was completely pathetic. He was stripped of his $5,000 tailored suits and forced into a stiff, scratchy, bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. His expensive styled haircut grew greasy and unkempt. The man who used to complain if his imported champagne was not chilled to the exact perfect temperature was now forced to eat tasteless mush from a plastic tray while sitting on a cold metal bench. The sensory overload of the maximum security block completely broke his fragile mind. The constant echoing shouts, the slamming of heavy steel doors, the harsh fluorescent lights that never turned off, and the terrifying proximity to violent inmates shattered his arrogant superiority complex into a million jagged pieces. He spent his nights huddled on a thin, terrible mattress, jumping at every single shadow, completely paralyzed by the fear of the men around him. He learned very quickly that his prep school vocabulary and his condescending attitude meant absolutely nothing when you are locked in a cage. Weeks dragged on, turning into months as the federal prosecutors built an impenetrable case against him. Bradley aged 10 years in the span of 3 months. The crushing anxiety and the complete isolation eroded his sanity. He had no visitors. His former high society friends acted like he never even existed. The violent loan sharks he still owed $12 million to were waiting patiently for him to be transferred to the general prison population, so they could finally collect their debt in blood. He was a man standing on the edge of a massive cliff, just waiting for the wind to push him over. Finally, the crisp autumn morning of his official sentencing hearing arrived. I put on my best custom-tailored suit. It was a deep charcoal gray paired with a crisp white shirt and a solid burgundy tie. I looked like the absolute embodiment of untouchable authority. My driver took me to the federal courthouse, and I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, taking a seat in the very front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. The courtroom was packed with journalists, financial regulators, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the final spectacular fall of the city's most notorious, fraudulent executive. The heavy side door of the courtroom slowly clicked open. 2 massive armed federal marshals walked into the room leading a prisoner by a heavy steel chain. It was Bradley. He shuffled slowly into the courtroom, his ankles bound by heavy iron shackles that clinked loudly with every pathetic step. His wrists were handcuffed and attached to a thick chain wrapped tightly around his waist. He looked incredibly small, thin, and entirely defeated. His skin was a sickly pale gray, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, surrounded by dark, heavy bags of exhaustion and sheer terror. He kept his head down, staring at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the people he had spent years lying to. He was guided to the defense table, sitting down heavily next to his overworked public defender, who barely even looked at him. The judge had not yet entered the room. The murmurs of the crowded gallery buzzed in the air. Bradley slowly lifted his heavy head, turning his neck to scan the gallery behind him. He was searching the crowd, looking for a single sympathetic face, looking for a miracle, looking for any sign that his miserable life was not completely over. His hollow, desperate eyes swept across the front row and abruptly stopped. He locked eyes directly with me. I did not glare at him. I did not look angry. I sat perfectly straight, resting my hands calmly on the handle of my wooden cane. I looked at the broken, shackled man who had planned to steal my entire legacy, and I gave him a very slow, very quiet, and completely terrifying smile. In that exact fleeting moment, as he stared at the 73-year-old black man sitting in a power suit radiating absolute complete victory, the final devastating realization crashed down upon Bradley. He suddenly understood the true nature of the game we had been playing for the last 3 months. He realized that when he thought he was brilliantly manipulating a confused, vulnerable old sheep, he had actually been actively lured into a perfectly designed trap by a patient, calculating wolf. He realized he had never once been the hunter. He had always been the prey. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom swung shut, sealing the fate of the 2 people sitting at the defense table. The room was packed to absolute capacity. Journalists, local business leaders, and curious onlookers filled every single wooden bench waiting to see the final chapter of the most notorious financial betrayal in Atlanta history. I sat in the front row wearing a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit, resting my hands calmly on my wooden cane. A few feet away from me sat my daughter Naomi and her husband Bradley. They were both wearing faded orange prison jumpsuits, their wrists bound by heavy steel handcuffs. They looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant hedge fund manager and the spoiled high society wife had been entirely erased, leaving behind two hollow, terrified shells waiting for the final swing of the executioner's axe. The bailiff ordered the courtroom to rise as the federal judge took her seat at the high mahogany bench. The judge looked down at Bradley and Naomi with a cold, unforgiving stare. She arranged her papers and asked if the primary victim of this conspiracy wished to make a statement before the final sentencing was handed down. Lincoln. My towering corporate lawyer placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as I slowly stood up. I did not walk to the podium like a broken elderly man seeking pity. I walked with the slow, deliberate, and absolute authority of a king addressing a conquered rebellion. I stood at the wooden podium and looked out over the crowded courtroom. The entire room fell so silent that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I did not look at my daughter or my former son-in-law. I looked directly at the judge, and I spoke with a deep, resonant voice that carried the weight of 40 hard years. I told the court that I was born in a time and a place where a black man was not supposed to own anything, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire. I told them that I built my legacy with calloused hands bleeding on the loading docks and fighting through a system that was specifically designed to keep me at the absolute bottom. I built my company alongside my beautiful late wife, Clarice, so that our family would never have to beg for a seat at the table. We gave our daughter a life of unimaginable privilege. We gave her the world. And in return, she brought a parasite into our home and conspired to strip me of my wealth, my dignity, and my freedom. I explained to the silent courtroom that Bradley and Naomi did not just commit a financial crime. They committed a profound moral atrocity. They weaponized the medical system, plotting to drug me and lock me inside a maximum security psychiatric ward just so they could liquidate my assets and pay off millions of dollars in violent underground debts. They smiled in my face, ate dinner at my table, and counted down the minutes until my heart would supposedly stop beating. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the podium, making sure my next words echoed in the nightmares of the two prisoners sitting behind me. I told the judge that I was not standing here asking for justice because my heart was broken. My heart healed the exact moment I realized I was dealing with predators instead of family. I told the court that I was standing here to ensure that these two individuals were completely and permanently removed from society. They thought they were the apex predators hunting a weak old man. They thought my quiet patience was stupidity, but they forgot that wisdom is forged in silence, and a quiet man is always the deadliest person in the room. I asked the judge to show them the exact same level of mercy they showed me when they planned my funeral over a cup of morning coffee. Absolute zero. I turned around and walked back to my seat in the front row. The gallery was completely mesmerized. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. The sheer gravity of my statement hung over the room like a heavy storm cloud. The federal judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the defense table. She did not bother to hide her absolute disgust. She told Bradley and Naomi that in her 20 years on the federal bench, she had rarely seen a conspiracy so deeply rooted in unadulterated greed and sheer human cruelty. She stated that their plot to falsely commit a perfectly sane elderly man for financial gain was one of the most despicable acts of elder abuse this city had ever witnessed. The judge instructed Bradley to stand up. He struggled to rise, his heavy chains rattling loudly against the wooden table. His legs were shaking so badly the bailiff had to hold him by the arm to keep him upright. The judge handed down his sentence without a single ounce of hesitation. For the charges of massive wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and severe elder abuse, Bradley Sterling was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. Bradley let out a hollow, gasping sound. His eyes rolled back and his knees completely buckled. The bailiffs caught him before he hit the floor, dragging his dead weight back into his chair. 20 years in a concrete cage, completely surrounded by violent men. He would be an old, broken man by the time he ever saw the outside of a prison wall again. The violent loan sharks he still owed millions of dollars to would be waiting for him inside those walls. His life was officially and permanently over. The judge then ordered Naomi to stand. My daughter was weeping so hysterically she could barely breathe. She looked at me one last time, begging silently for a miracle, for a sudden change of heart. I just stared back at her with a completely blank expression. The judge told Naomi that her betrayal of her own father and her disgusting embezzlement of her dead mother's cancer charity proved that she was a danger to the very fabric of society. For her direct role in the conspiracy and the financial fraud, Naomi Sterling was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Naomi let out a blood-curdling scream that pierced the silent courtroom. She collapsed onto the table, sobbing uncontrollably as the bailiffs immediately moved in, grabbing her arms and hauling her away. Bradley was dragged out right behind her, his head hanging low, entirely unresponsive to the world around him. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, echoing with the sound of absolute finality. The malicious conspiracy was completely destroyed. The venomous snakes had been eradicated from my garden. I walked out of the federal courthouse with Lincoln walking closely by my side. The bright Atlanta sun was shining high in the clear blue sky. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean. We walked down the wide concrete steps toward my waiting armored sedan. Reporters were shouting questions from behind the security barricades, but I ignored them completely. I had won the war. I had protected my empire, and I had sent the traitors to their rightful graves. I climbed into the back seat of the luxury car, and the driver slowly pulled away from the chaotic courthouse. Lincoln poured us both a small glass of sparkling water, toasting to a flawless legal victory. I clinked my glass against his, but as I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling city skyline, a sudden heavy realization washed over me. I had successfully protected the massive multi-billion-dollar logistics and real estate empire that Clarice and I had bled to build. Every warehouse, every high-rise building, and every single bank account was completely secure. But as I sat in the quiet luxury of my car, an immense cold void opened up deep inside my chest. My daughter was gone forever, locked in a federal cage. My wife was resting in the cemetery. I was a 73-year-old king sitting alone on a massive throne of gold and concrete. I had eliminated all my enemies, but I had also eliminated my entire bloodline. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands, and a terrifying question echoed in the empty silence of my mind. The empire was safe today, but when my time finally comes, who on earth is going to inherit this massive kingdom? Sitting in the quiet luxury of my armored sedan as it pulled away from the federal courthouse, I felt the crushing weight of a hollow victory. I had successfully protected the massive multi-billion-dollar logistics and real estate empire that Clarice and I had bled to build. I had sent my treacherous daughter and her arrogant husband to federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. But as I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling Atlanta skyline, an immense cold void opened up deep inside my chest. I was a 73-year-old king sitting entirely alone on a massive throne of gold and concrete. I had eliminated all my enemies, but I had also seemingly eliminated my entire bloodline. The empire was completely safe today, but when my time finally comes, who on earth is going to inherit this massive kingdom? That night I sat in my high-security penthouse staring out at the city lights, and a deeply buried memory surfaced in the quiet darkness. Naomi was not my only child. Clarice and I had a son first. His name was Andre. He was a good man, a hard-working, honest man, but he was tragically taken from us in a terrible highway accident nearly 15 years ago. He left behind a young boy named Malik. After my beautiful wife, Clarice, passed away, my heart was completely broken. I retreated deep into my corporate work and let Naomi handle all the personal family matters. Naomi told me that Malik's mother wanted a clean break from our family because the memories were just too painful. Naomi told me they moved out of state and explicitly asked for absolutely no contact. I was drowning in my own blinding sorrow, and I foolishly believed her. But after watching my daughter betray me in the most evil way imaginable, I realized I could not trust a single word she had ever spoken. I immediately called my corporate lawyer Lincoln and ordered a quiet, comprehensive background investigation. The truth Lincoln uncovered the next morning made my blood boil hotter than it ever had before. Naomi had lied to both of us. She had maliciously intercepted my letters to Malik. She had quietly canceled the generous college trust fund I had set up for him, claiming to the bank that my business was bankrupt. She systematically drove my only biological grandson away so she could ensure she was the sole undisputed heir to the massive Pierce legacy. When Lincoln handed me the file detailing Malik's life, I sat in my office and wept. I am a man who did not shed a single tear when I sent my own daughter to a federal penitentiary, but reading about the struggles of my grandson broke me entirely. Malik had to work grueling night shifts at a warehouse to pay for his mother's hospital bills. She passed away 3 years ago because they could not afford the premium health care that I could have provided with a single simple signature. Naomi knew all of this. She knew they were suffering, and she deliberately let them drown to protect her future wealth. The very next morning, I did not send a lawyer or a representative. I told my private driver to stay at the penthouse. I drove myself in my old reliable pickup truck, navigating the busy highways toward the deep industrial outskirts of Atlanta. I drove into a rough working-class neighborhood where the glossy glass towers of corporate wealth completely disappeared, replaced by cracked asphalt chain-link fences and the heavy smell of exhaust fumes. I pulled into the gravel lot of a small, independent auto repair shop. It was not a fancy corporate dealership. It was a gritty, hard-working garage filled with dismantled engines and the loud, rhythmic banging of heavy metal. I stepped out of my truck into the sweltering afternoon heat. I walked slowly into the dark bay of the garage. There were 3 cars lifted on heavy hydraulic hoists. Underneath a battered sedan, I saw a pair of heavy work boots and legs covered in dark grease stains. I stood there and waited, leaning quietly on my wooden cane. A moment later, a young black man slid out from under the car on a wooden creeper. He stood up, wiping his thick hands on a stained red shop rag. My breath caught heavily in my throat. It was exactly like looking into a mirror that reached 50 years into the past. Malik was 25 years old now. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the exact same fierce, independent posture his father Andre used to have. His face was a perfect, beautiful blend of my late son and my wife Clarice. But what struck me the most were his hands. They were heavily calloused, bruised, and stained with dark motor oil. They were the hands of a man who worked for every single dollar he earned. He did not have the soft, manicured fingers of a privileged country club kid. He had the rough hands of a true builder. Malik looked at me. He did not look confused or surprised. He knew exactly who I was. The bright, welcoming smile he usually gave to his customers instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, defensive wall of pure ice. He tossed the red rag onto a metal workbench and took a cautious step toward me. He did not call me grandfather. He did not ask how I was doing. He looked at my expensive clothes and my wooden cane and told me in a flat tone that the shop was currently closed to new customers. I kept my voice incredibly calm and highly respectful. I told him I was not there for an oil change. I told him I came to see my grandson. Malik let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed loudly off the cinder block walls. He told me I was about 15 years too late. He said Naomi made it perfectly clear after his father died that the Pierce family considered him and his mother a massive financial burden. He told me Naomi came to their small apartment years ago and threatened his grieving mother with expensive corporate lawyers if they ever tried to contact me for money. I felt a sickening knot twist deep in my stomach. My own daughter had used my name and my power to terrorize a grieving widow and a fatherless child. She had painted me as a ruthless, cold-hearted billionaire who wanted absolutely nothing to do with his own flesh and blood. Malik looked me dead in the eye and told me he did not need my sudden charity. He told me he built his life and his business with his own 2 hands. He said he worked 3 exhausting jobs to keep the lights on when his mother got sick, and he never once asked for a single handout from the wealthy man sitting in his downtown mansion. He spoke with such intense raw pride and fierce anger that I could not even be mad at him. I was actually profoundly proud of the young man standing in front of me. He possessed the exact same unbreakable spirit that helped me survive the brutal streets of Atlanta decades ago. He was a true Pierce through and through. I knew that arguing with him would be completely useless. A man who has built heavy walls out of deep pain and betrayal does not tear them down just because you suddenly show up and say you are sorry. He needed absolute, undeniable proof. He needed to see the truth for himself. I did not raise my voice defensively. I did not tell him about the massive multi-billion-dollar empire waiting for a rightful heir. I did not tell him that the treacherous woman who lied to him was currently rotting in a federal prison cell for the rest of her life. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my charcoal coat and pulled out a small, beautifully carved wooden box. It was the special box Clarice used to keep her most precious family memories and original letters in. I walked slowly over to the greasy metal workbench and placed the small wooden box down gently next to his heavy steel wrenches. I looked at my grandson, feeling the heavy, agonizing weight of the lost years, but also feeling a rising sense of profound hope. I told Malik that I was not there to force him to do anything he did not want to do. I told him I deeply respected the honorable, hard-working man he had become. I pointed my cane at the wooden box resting on the table. When you are ready to know the absolute truth about this family, I said, my voice quiet and completely steady, open it. I turned around and walked slowly out of the dark garage, leaving him standing there in the heavy silence. I waited patiently for exactly 2 weeks, letting the brutal reality of the world do the heavy lifting. I knew that the unforgiving nature of the city would eventually force his hand. Malik was a brilliant, hard-working mechanic, but the aggressive gentrification creeping into the industrial outskirts of Atlanta did not care about honest, calloused hands or generational roots. A massive, predatory urban development firm had deliberately targeted his entire industrial block. They were corporate vultures wearing expensive suits, using ruthless, eminent domain tactics and suffocating legal threats to force all the small, independent business owners to sell their land for absolute pennies on the dollar. They employed dirty psychological warfare to break his spirit. They managed to cut off his primary commercial water supply, claiming there were mandatory emergency pipe renovations. They deliberately parked heavy construction machinery right in front of his garage doors, completely killing his daily customer traffic. Malik was drowning in mounting legal fees and facing imminent forced eviction. He was cornered by powerful men who wanted to crush him into the dirt. That is the exact moment of absolute desperation, when he finally sat down in his dark, quiet garage and opened the small carved wooden box I had left on his greasy metal workbench. I had filled that wooden box with the undeniable absolute truth. Inside the velvet lining were dozens of handwritten letters I had sent to him and his grieving mother over the past 15 years. Every single envelope was aggressively stamped with bright red ink reading "Return to Sender." Naomi had maliciously intercepted every single one of them. I included the official certified bank records showing the massive multi-million-dollar college trust fund I had established for him the very day he was born. Right behind those documents were the forged withdrawal slips that Naomi had used to completely drain and cancel that entire account just days after my wife passed away. But the most important and devastating item in that box was a handwritten letter from his grandmother, Clarice. She wrote beautifully about how much I loved him and how my heart completely shattered into pieces when we lost his father, Andre. She explicitly warned him that Naomi was blinded by intense jealousy and a dark, bottomless greed. When Malik sat alone in his dark garage reading those fragile papers, smelling the faint, lingering scent of his grandmother's perfume, the heavy, thick wall of resentment he had built against me completely crumbled. He realized in one single agonizing moment that his entire life of poverty and daily struggle was not caused by a billionaire grandfather who had callously abandoned him. His suffering had been meticulously orchestrated by a treacherous aunt who wanted the entire financial pie strictly for herself. The burning anger he had directed at me for 15 years instantly shifted and locked onto the true villain of his life. The very next morning, my private executive secretary buzzed my intercom at the top floor of the Obsidian Holdings Tower. She told me a young man wearing a faded canvas work jacket and heavy boots was standing in the pristine marble lobby demanding to see me. I told her to bypass all security protocols and send him up to my office immediately. When Malik walked into my massive corner office, he looked around at the towering glass windows, the imported luxury leather furniture, and the breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The sheer immense scale of my hidden wealth was finally hitting him. But he was not intimidated. He did not shrink back or cower like a beggar. He walked right up to my heavy mahogany desk and dropped the wooden box onto the polished wood. He looked me dead in the eye, completely fearless. He told me he had stayed awake all night reading every single word in that box. He told me he finally understood the profound evil Naomi had committed, and he knew she was currently rotting in a federal prison cell where she truly belonged. Then he took a deep, heavy breath and laid out his current desperate situation. He told me about the ruthless developers actively trying to crush his auto repair shop and steal the land his mother had left him. He swallowed his immense, fierce pride and asked me for a short-term loan so he could hire a decent corporate lawyer to fight the unfair eviction. This was the absolute crucial moment of truth. A weak grandfather driven by years of heavy guilt would have simply pulled out a checkbook and written a blank check to make his grandson's problems magically disappear. I could have easily bought that entire urban development firm with the spare change sitting in my secondary accounts and fired their entire board of directors by noon. But I did not build an untouchable commercial empire by handing out unearned lifelines to people who do not know how to fight. I needed to know if the boy had the true blood of a conqueror flowing in his veins. I looked at him with an entirely cold and calculated expression. I told him I was not a charity foundation. I told him I would not give him a single dime of my money to pay off a corporate bully. Malik clenched his jaw tightly, his large fists tightening at his sides. I saw the flash of hot anger in his eyes. I told him that if I bought his freedom today, he would just remain a slave to a different master tomorrow. I told him that if he wanted to survive in this ruthless city, he needed to learn how to fight like a titan instead of acting like a victim. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a massive, detailed topographical blueprint map of his specific industrial neighborhood, along with the developer's public financial filings. I pushed the heavy documents across my desk. I told him to look at the paperwork and tell me exactly how he would destroy them without spending a single dollar of my money. I sat back in my chair and watched him. I watched his sharp young mind shift gears. He did not complain about the test being unfair. He did not ask for a hint. He leaned his broad shoulders over my desk, tracing his rough, grease-stained fingers along the intricate property lines and the dense corporate jargon. For 20 long minutes, the massive office was completely silent. He was applying the exact same meticulous diagnostic logic he used to rebuild complex car engines to the battlefield of corporate warfare. He was searching for the broken valve, the weak structural point in their massive financial machine. Suddenly, Malik looked up from the blueprints and a slow, highly dangerous smile spread across his face. It was the exact same chilling, predatory smile I used to wear when I cornered a corrupt city politician in the 1980s. Malik pointed his thick finger at a small, faint blue line intersecting the developer's proposed foundation grid. He told me the arrogant developers had rushed their filings for rapid commercial zoning, but they had completely ignored the historical underground drainage runoff that connected directly to a federally protected city water reserve. He explained his strategy with terrifying cold precision. He told me that if he filed a highly publicized emergency environmental injunction with the city council based on severe potential groundwater contamination, the developer's entire multi-million-dollar commercial project would be immediately frozen in bureaucratic litigation for at least 5 long years. He noted that their financial filings showed they were highly over-leveraged on short-term, high-interest loans. If the project was delayed by an environmental scandal, their wealthy investors would completely panic and pull all their funding, destroying the development firm overnight. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, absolutely stunned and profoundly moved. He did not just find a temporary legal loophole to save his small garage for another month. He found the exact vital bleeding artery of his massive enemy and figured out exactly how to sever it with a single flawless surgical strike. He had absolutely no formal corporate business degrees. He had no expensive Wall Street training or country club mentors. But he possessed a raw, terrifying strategic genius that simply cannot be taught in any elite classroom. He possessed the exact same lethal, unbreakable business instincts that I had used to build the Pierce Legacy Group from the dirt up. I looked at the young, strong man standing fiercely in front of my desk. He was a survivor, a relentless fighter, and a brilliant tactical mind. The exhausting, agonizing, cold void in my chest completely vanished, replaced by a burning, soaring sense of absolute triumph. The brutal, grueling test was completely finished. I looked at the calloused hands and the sharp, intelligent eyes of my biological grandson, and I knew with absolute flawless certainty that my massive, invisible empire had finally found its true and worthy king. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked around to stand right in front of my grandson. I did not offer him a small business loan. I did not offer to pay his legal fees. Instead, I told him to go back to his garage, lock the heavy metal rolling doors, wash the dark motor oil off his hands, and pack a bag. I told him that his days of scraping by on the greasy concrete floor fighting for scraps against corporate bullies were completely over. I told him that the predatory urban developers who tried to steal his auto repair shop would be the very first target on his new agenda, but he was not going to fight them from the dirt anymore. We were going to crush them legally, financially, and absolutely from the very top of the city. The very next morning, my armored sedan pulled up to the curb of his small apartment building. Malik stepped out into the bright morning sun wearing a clean button-down shirt and a pair of dark slacks. He looked uncertain, but his jaw was set with that same fierce, unbreakable determination I had seen the day before. We rode in total silence through the busy streets of Atlanta, leaving the forgotten industrial outskirts behind and entering the towering glass and steel canyons of the financial district. I brought him to the massive, gleaming headquarters of the Pierce Legacy Group. When we walked through the soaring glass doors of the lobby, the entire atmosphere shifted. Security guards stood at strict attention, and wealthy executives in $1,000 suits stopped their conversations to nod respectfully as we passed. Malik looked around, his wide eyes taking in the sheer immense scale of the building. We stepped into the private executive elevator, and I swiped my biometric access card, taking us all the way to the top floor. I walked him down the quiet, plush, carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors to a massive boardroom that overlooked the entire sprawling city. I walked over to the long, polished mahogany table and pressed a button, turning on the massive digital displays covering the walls. The screens lit up instantly with interactive maps showing dozens of commercial high-rises, massive logistics warehouses, sprawling residential developments, and international shipping contracts. I turned to my grandson and I told him the absolute, undeniable truth. I told him that this was not just a successful company. This was a fortress. This was a massive, untouchable empire built by black hands in a city that originally wanted to see those exact same hands in iron chains. I explained to him that in this country, immense wealth is rarely kept in black families for more than a single generation. Usually the second or third generation gets far too comfortable, lazy, and deeply entitled. They forget the brutal, agonizing sacrifices of their ancestors. They let greedy vultures like his Uncle Bradley infiltrate the family and bleed the empire completely dry. I told Malik that he was the ultimate cure to that toxic disease. He knew exactly what it meant to starve. He knew what it meant to struggle desperately to pay a simple medical bill. Because he knew the bitter, agonizing taste of poverty, he would never ever take this massive fortune for granted. I pointed at the glowing screens and told him that every single building belonged to our bloodline, and now it was all going to belong to him. Malik was completely speechless. The astronomical weight of his true inheritance crashed down upon his broad shoulders, but it did not crush him. It ignited a massive, roaring fire deep inside his soul. The transition of absolute power began that very afternoon. I did not just hand him the keys to the kingdom and walk away to retire. A crown that is simply given is a crown that is easily stolen by the first ambitious snake that comes along. I made him earn every single inch of his new authority. For the next 6 months, Malik lived and breathed the Pierce Legacy Group. He traded his heavy canvas work jackets for custom-tailored charcoal suits, but he absolutely refused to soften his calloused hands. My oldest friend and corporate lawyer Lincoln took Malik entirely under his wing. Lincoln was absolutely ruthless with his daily training. He locked Malik in a quiet conference room for hours, going over the dense fine print of complex corporate mergers. Lincoln taught my grandson the ruthless, complex language of corporate law. He taught him how to read the hidden traps in a contract, how to leverage massive tax liabilities, and how to completely ruin a corrupt competitor without ever leaving a single fingerprint behind. I taught him the philosophy of absolute power. I taught him that real wealth is not about buying expensive sports cars or showing off at elite country clubs to impress people who secretly hate you. Real wealth is about quiet control. It is about extreme patience, deep, unshakable loyalty, and knowing exactly when to strike your enemies. Malik absorbed every single brutal lesson like a starving man sitting at a royal feast. He possessed a terrifying natural instinct for high-level business strategy. When we sat in high-level executive meetings with arrogant bankers who tried to use complicated financial jargon to confuse him, Malik would lean forward, resting his large, calloused hands on the glass table and completely deconstruct their financial models in a matter of minutes. He commanded absolute respect not because he happened to share my last name, but because of his undeniable, sharp intelligence and his fierce, unapologetic presence. He immediately fired the lazy executives who had grown comfortable and complacent under my daughter's previous toxic influence. He promoted hardworking, loyal employees who actually understood the grueling daily grind. He breathed massive, fresh life into the entire corporate structure. I watched him exact his flawless revenge on the urban developers who had tried to steal his auto shop. He used the massive capital of Pierce Legacy Group to quietly and completely buy out the commercial bank loans of those exact developers. He became their primary debt holder overnight. Then he legally foreclosed on their properties, bankrupting the very men who had tried to intimidate him into the dirt. It was a flawless, brutal victory, and he executed it with the calm, steady hand of a seasoned veteran. The executives in the city quickly learned a very harsh lesson. The Pierce Empire was not fading away with an old, tired man. It was roaring back to life with a young, hungry, and brilliant new king. One quiet evening in the late autumn, I was sitting in a comfortable armchair out on the wide, sweeping balcony of my secure penthouse. The cool Atlanta breeze rustled gently through the trees far below. The city lights sparkled like a massive ocean of diamonds stretching out into the dark, endless horizon. I held a glass of warm herbal tea, resting my wooden cane gently against the metal railing. Through the large sliding glass doors, I could see straight into the massive home office. Malik was sitting at the heavy oak desk, illuminated by the soft golden glow of a brass desk lamp. He had his expensive suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, and his crisp white sleeves were rolled up, revealing his strong forearms. He was deeply engrossed in a massive stack of commercial zoning files and complex project reports, preparing for a major board meeting the very next morning. He was not out partying at nightclubs. He was not wasting the hard-earned family fortune on superficial nonsense. He was protecting the legacy with every single ounce of his strength and his brilliant mind. I sat there in the quiet, beautiful darkness, feeling the heavy, exhausting burden of the last 15 years completely lift off my tired shoulders. The treacherous snakes had been eradicated, and the true righteous bloodline had been beautifully restored. I looked up at the vast, dark sky filled with countless shining stars. A profound, deep sense of absolute peace washed over my entire soul. I smiled a soft, quiet smile, letting the cool night air brush against my aged face. "I did it," I whispered softly into the quiet night. "I kept my promise, Clarice. It has been 2 full years since the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse closed on the absolute darkest chapter of my entire life. I am 75 years old today, and I can honestly say I have never felt more incredibly alive. The heavy, suffocating burden of constantly looking over my shoulder is completely gone forever. I no longer have to hunch my back, lean heavily on a wooden cane, or pretend that my sharp mind is slowly slipping away into a dark fog. I wake up every single morning and I walk with my spine perfectly straight and my head held incredibly high. The sprawling, beautiful city of Atlanta wakes up with me, and the massive commercial real estate and logistics empire I built from the absolute dirt continues to thrive and dominate the market. But I am no longer the tired man sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany boardroom table. I am simply a man enjoying the quiet, beautiful peace he fought so desperately to secure. Far away from the gleaming glass towers and the plush executive suites of my corporate headquarters, the 2 treacherous people who tried to destroy my life are living the exact nightmare they maliciously designed for me. Bradley and Naomi are locked deep inside the unforgiving, freezing concrete walls of the federal penitentiary. They have absolutely no access to luxury leased vehicles, expensive designer clothes, or exclusive high society galas. They spend their miserable days wearing faded, stiff orange jumpsuits, eating tasteless mush from scratched plastic trays, and answering to the harsh metallic sounds of heavy steel doors slamming shut. I heard through my corporate lawyers that Naomi tried to send me a desperate handwritten letter late last year, weeping for forgiveness and begging for a small cash deposit into her prison commissary account. I told my security staff to throw it directly into the shredder unopened. You cannot willingly poison the well and then drop to your knees begging for a drink of water when you are dying of thirst. They made their calculated evil choices, and now they get to live with the brutal, agonizing consequences of their bottomless greed for the rest of their natural lives. While the traitors rot in the dark shadows of a prison cell, my biological grandson Malik is shining brighter than I ever could have possibly imagined. He took the absolute reins of the Pierce Legacy Group and drove our family company to unprecedented astronomical heights. He aggressively expanded our commercial real estate portfolio across the entire state of Georgia. But more importantly, he launched a massive multi-million-dollar funding initiative to support and elevate young, hardworking Black entrepreneurs in the very same rough working-class neighborhoods where he grew up scraping by. Malik never forgot his humble roots. He still has those rough, calloused hands, and he still treats every single employee, from the night shift janitor to the senior vice president, with the exact same deep, unwavering respect. He is a true, honorable king who leads his people with absolute integrity and flawless vision. Seeing him thrive and conquer the business world fills my tired soul with a massive, overwhelming joy. The beautiful, sacred legacy of my late wife Clarice is completely and permanently safe in his strong, capable hands. I spend my quiet, peaceful days sitting on the wide, sunny balcony of my high-security penthouse, watching the bustling, energetic city far below my feet. I drink my dark black coffee. I read my favorite books, and I smile a genuine warm smile. The absolute power of patient wisdom and quiet dignity entirely crushed the malicious forces of bottomless greed. I survived the brutal racist storms of my youth, and I survived the treacherous, deadly betrayal of my own blood. I am Donovan Pierce, and my story is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of a man who refuses to be a victim. Blood makes you related, but greed makes you a stranger. I spent my life building an empire from the ground up, believing that providing everything for my daughter would earn her love. Instead, it bred a dangerous entitlement. When they looked at me, they did not see a father, they saw an expiring asset. But wisdom is forged in silence, and a quiet man is always the deadliest in the room. Never apologize for protecting what you built. Respect must be earned even by your own blood, and treachery should never go unpunished. True legacy belongs only to the honorable. Did you find this story empowering and completely satisfying? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic, treacherous family members to permanently protect your own peace and personal dignity? Let me know your thoughts and tell me exactly which city you are watching from in the comments section below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories. See you in the next video.